just remind everybody to switch off their mobile phones and any devices which do make a noise, and in particular your tablet device. You'll all know by now that the quickest way to turn it to silent is function and F8, and also remind members to declare any interest, financial or otherwise, just as we move through today's business. I suppose really just at that point, I will declare that my my brother is a member of the Equality Commission. I'm not sure how relevant that is, but just so that it is on the record. Apologies, I haven't received any apologies unless members are aware of any.
May get here.
She may or may, but
and Derry, so it could be.
we'll put an apology in for her. Okay. Sorry, is Sandra coming?
She's on her way here.
Sandra's on her way, so it's for lateness. Jonathan just arrived. Okay, moving then chairperson's business. We have the BELB annual report 2013-14. It was laid in the business office. If members are content that we write to DE just seeking sight of the Interboard Cred business plan and details of the school's training satisfaction survey, that was something which was picked up in that publication. Members may have other things which they've noticed, and certainly if you want to bring that to our attention. And there's also an issue, and it's of interest to me, around looked after children. If you're happy that we write to the board just seeking an explanation, just in respect of commentary just relating to difficulties issuing personal education plans for black children, and retention of information by Health and Social Care Trust. This was highlighted to us in the RAISE paper that we received last week as well. So members are content that we do that. Any other issues at this stage? No. Draft minutes of our meeting the 28th of January. They're at page 6. So if you're content that they accurately reflect that meeting, we can agree those minutes. Okay, great, thank you. Just matters arising, just with regard to our inquiry, just refer you to the SkyDrive Pro link, which includes correspondence from the department in respect of the Delivering Social Change Shared Education Signature Project, and there's also an Assembly research paper on shared and integrated education. So if members are content, those submissions are listed on our webpage. Okay. Thank you. We have, as you're aware, we have 3 briefings today, so it is going to be a busy morning. Our first is from the department in relation to the Northern Ireland Teachers Pension Scheme. Just refer you to the clerk's cover note at page 41 and relevant papers to the SL14 Teacher Superannuation Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2015. Welcome to the committee again. We have Seamus Gallagher, Head of Pensions Policy Team, and Brian Quinn, Pensions Policy Team from the Department of Education. You're both very welcome to committee, and if you'd like to make an opening statement, and if there are any questions from members,
okay.
Take those.
Thank you very much, Chair. Members, for inviting us back again. The purpose of this rule is to bring forward amendments to the Teacher Superannuation Regulations 1998 to ensure consistency of treatment between those members who are staying in that scheme because they're fully protected and those who move into the new scheme. So we've covered 4 main areas in this set of regs. Member contributions, which we had consulted on extensively back last year, and we've already introduced these contribution rates in the new reform scheme. So this simply replaces the existing contribution rates with the ones which we had already consulted on and are applying to members in the new scheme. Ill health provisions, we had extended the time limit for members to apply after leaving service from 6 months to 2 years in the new scheme, and this again that applies that provision to the existing rules for those who are staying. And we've brought forward some clarification on how the career average service or pension would be counted against abatement rules, and we've provided some clarification about how the new club transfer rules will apply in the existing scheme, and we've put in a 2-year grace period for members who hadn't previously exercised comparable benefit transfer. So they've got 2 years from April 15 to do that. Those are people who had moved from one jurisdiction to another and not exercised that option to date. So that's really what these regs do. They're fairly basic.
Okay, and just with regards to the consultation process, how many responses had you?
We had only one response. It was from the Government Actuaries Department, and it was some technical issues about how the regulations were framed, and we took those comments into account in actually the final set of regs.
And did you have any correspondence from the unions in relation to this?
We had no formal responses to consultation, but we have been consulting with them on an ongoing basis on all of this. We meet them every month at the Teacher Superannuation Consultative Committee. There were no specific views.
They didn't raise any particular concern?
No.
Okay, thank you. Members, have you any comments?
Thank you for coming in again.
Okay, no, that was short. Oh,
Just a very quick one. Currently, many of the people who go into the teaching profession in this part of the world have to go to work in England for a number of years and so on at the minute. Will this scheme, if they're working in England at the minute and decide to come back to Northern Ireland at some stage later, it'll transfer with no hitches whatsoever?
No, the new club transfer arrangements the intention behind them is it'll leave people in the position as if they'd never moved.
That's it. Thank you.
okay, thank you. Before I conclude, we did receive correspondence in relation to pension contributions. Are members content with that correspondence, or have you any questions you'd like to put to Seamus and Brian while they're here?
You can just push the button here to get the...
It's actually it's printed for you in tabled item.
Yeah, I know, but tabled items is a different page. I don't have a question about that, Chairman. It's just to note the fact that they still stick to the point that the teachers' scheme is ungenerous compared to others. And if you look at the new contribution rates compared to the local government or the what's now called judicial or the civil service, it kind of makes a point. The employer's contribution 22.3% for civil service, 20% for local government, 17.7% for teachers, and the contribution rates from the employees 9.6% from teachers, 6.4% for local government, and 5.6% for civil service. So it seems out of line. I just wonder what
The standard contribution, when you add both together, is fairly consistent. It's historical in terms of how it's developed over time as to how much the employer pays and how much the employee pays, and it's developed over a period of 70, 80 years, and it's all that's happened in the interim and pay negotiations and how much these people are paid and what protection you need to give to lower paid members to keep them in the scheme. Like, for example, the generally NILGOS people in NILGOS are paid considerably lower than teachers, and civil servants are paid considerably lower than teachers. So it's a balance, and it's historical. But in general, the total contribution rate into all of the schemes, when you combine the employer and the member, is fairly consistent. Health, where there's a balance of employees, the rates are practically equal to teachers.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yet you would think that health workers on average would be paid considerably less than teachers too.
Some of them are paid considerably less, but when you look at the people at the higher echelons, doctors, etc., they're paid considerably more, and they do tier their contributions. It's not all, you don't all pay the same amount. It's an average. And
Yeah, well,
same for teachers.
I presume these figures are average, you know. But I mean, there's plenty of highly paid civil servants as well, you know.
There are a few, but the majority are lower paid.
There's only a few.
Okay.
I'm done.
You're done. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So are members generally content with the proposed statutory rule, the Teachers Superannuation Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2015? Okay. You're content, then the committee will be asked to consider the late rule either later this month or in early March. Okay, thank you. Okay. Before we just move on to our next item of business, just would like to welcome Kyle Quinn, who is on work experience with Robin Newton. So you're very welcome. Kyle's a pupil at Wellington College. I hope you enjoy your morning with us. Thank you for coming. Hope it doesn't put you off politics. Okay, so our next session is in relation to our inquiry into shared and integrated education. We have the Community Relations Council and Equality Commission Northern Ireland with us. Can I refer you to the clerk's cover note at page 73 and refer you to both submissions to the inquiry. I'd like to welcome all our witnesses this morning. If you'd like to introduce yourselves, and I understand then you both organisations are going to give a short statement and we'll follow up with some questions.
Thank you. It's great to be here to sort of add some verbals and a bit of discourse to the stuff that you've already had. So I'm taking it for granted that you've had the opportunity to read through both submissions. The way we're going to do this is simply I'm here to say welcome, to introduce colleagues. Peter's then going to lead off and speak for 5 or 6 minutes just in a broad strategic background to their submission. I'm going to do exactly the same thing from our submission, which means it'll probably just take about 10 minutes. And then we thought the most opportune thing to do would be to allow us to enter into some discourse around this. But it's a great honour to be here today and be able to talk to this. Michael Wardlow, I'm the Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission.
I'm Darren McKinstry, I'm the Director of Policy at the Equality Commission.
Peter Osborne, Chair of the Community Relations Council.
And Deputy McGlade, Director of Policy at the Community Relations Council.
Peter, are you far away?
Well, Chair and members, can I also mirror Michael's thanks for being here. I think it's an important inquiry that you're undertaking, important that you consider these issues, and I have to say from what I've read so far, obviously a very thorough inquiry to date. I want to say a couple of brief comments, as Michael said, from a broader perspective. I want to look at the inquiry into shared and integrated education in the context of peace building and the reconciliation work that has been done over many years in Northern Ireland and that remains to be done in the years and decades ahead of us. I also want to put on record how positive many of the achievements have been in this society over the last 10, 20 years or so, including achievements by all of the political parties that have contributed to the process, by members of civil society. Sometimes I think we don't recognise how far we have come, and we don't recognise the contribution that everybody has made, including politicians from all of the political parties and all backgrounds. This is a long-term process, mind you. The building of peace, the building of reconciliation may well take another 20, 30, 40 or 50 years. And in such a pacted process, as many would call it, there are considerable challenges and risks. There are risks that if we don't keep moving forward, we need to keep moving forward no matter how incrementally. There are risks that past battles will still be fought today in different terms, but still be fought over some of the same issues. There are risks that some things that are considered very necessary in a past decade are considered less necessary now. I think one of the issues that we need to face when it comes to education and children and young people is the need to keep moving forward for this generation of young people, because they will be leaders of the future, and it's important that we don't let them be shaped by what has shaped us and the factors that have shaped us in society today. Our focus is on outcomes for children, our focus is on outcomes around education, and it is about the needs of young people and the needs of this society, not a focus on particular systems or structures or forms. We want to see an optimum model for children and young people to learn and develop together, and remodelling that model to that optimum model is something that will take courage to change, and it will also take support to sustain the change that is needed. If we want to achieve the aims of TBUC, the Together Building a United Community strategy, we need to seriously tackle the needs around facilitating more and more of our children and young people to learn and develop together. Let me quote from TBUC directly. It says, "We want to continue to improve attitudes amongst our young people and to build a community where they can play a full and active role in building good relations." TBUC also talks about the need to take down interface barriers. It talks about the need for more shared housing. It talks about things like cross-community urban villages. If we are to be successful in any of those endeavours, in any of the targets and the aims that TBUC has set out, we need to have a united community where children and young people are learning and developing together now and increasingly in the future. But that means there are big challenges. Big challenges around things like relationships between those children and young people, relationships between parents of those children and young people, relationships between teachers. And that's a challenge for everybody, because in all of those contexts, separation is not a sustainable option. There are important challenges around understanding the economic benefits of children and young people learning and developing together. The benefits of ending or breaking down what is a system of virtual benign educational apartheid into something where sharing takes place much more vigorously than it does at the moment. Some people estimate that in some communities, schools coming together will save £100,000 in some villages. Well, that's £100,000 of saving to the education system that can be invested in different ways, £100,000 for critical services, and indeed £100,000 that can be added to reducing costs around the costs of division more generally. We need to understand what that means, and we need to really grasp the opportunities that are involved. The challenge also around building a cohesive community. If we are going to do that, we need an education system that tackles educational underachievement and involves communities in a more vibrant and representative way in the management of schools. And if you look down the road at Dundonald High School recently, where you see local communities getting more involved in the management of that school, I think it did a huge credit to that school and was extremely positive. And we also need to face up to the challenge of not avoiding the hard questions, the hard issues about what is sharing, about what criteria will be applied in sharing and integration, about what milestones there are in the continuum of change and the courage that is needed to make sure that change happens. So, in terms of the general introduction, I suppose I'd also reinforce 2 or 3 things. This is about children and young people. It's not about structures or systems or forms. It is what the needs of those children and young people have, and about what the needs of this society are. It is about the best education possible. It's about not letting down those from the most disadvantaged communities that are currently being failed by the education system. And it's about supporting the peace building and reconciliation needs in this society to try to help create and build a more united community in the future.
Peter, thanks. If I just pick up before I make a couple of specific points. We're on a journey. And the journey has been about how do we make our educational system more porous. But I think if we stick to systems, we miss the point. But this is focused on the young person who's at the centre of this. And it's how we make a shared opportunity for those young people. Now, on the one hand, we've had experiments for some years now, including, for example, integrated schools. We've had shared education. We've had Atlantic Philanthropies, IFI, people funding opportunities. But I do think, having moved through Shared Future, CSI, and now Together Building a United Community, with a little bit of moral imagination, I think we can make a significant difference. But I don't want you to be under any doubt. We can't put young people where adults are afraid to go. So education will not solve the underlying fault lines of the problem in this place we call home. It will certainly go some way towards that, but if we're really committed to this, this needs to be resourced. There's all sorts of other things within the educational system we need to address, so I don't think we should be under any misapprehension that shared education will deal with all the underlying educational inequalities. So I'm with Peter in this. This is about function and not form. Form should follow function. So in terms of, we believe as a Commission that societal mixing and cohesion is limited by, among other things, the fact that we don't have enough shared skills. Whether it's integrated schools or shared schools or schools in partnerships, however that works through, separation in education is one of the barriers to social cohesion and mixing in this society. Now, in terms of what we're saying is we're recommending a move to a system of education at the end which actually routinely allows young people to mix from as early as possible right through their early years until actually they leave school. It should not be the norm that young people don't meet somebody who's different when they go to further or higher education or step into the workplace or the apprenticeship for the first time. And sadly that remains a fact for significant numbers of young people. Now it's anybody's fault. And shared schools will not, as I said, be the only thing to try to bring a more cohesive and shared society, but it will be substantial. Because we've over 300,000 young people taking part on a day-to-day basis, interfacing with sometimes the other. But this sharing has to be deep, it has to be meaningful. It can't simply be moving together in the same classroom. I shop in Marks and Spencer's with people of other traditions. It doesn't make me love them more. I've had contact with them, but unless the contact is sustained, unless it's meaningful, unless it's resourced, unless teachers are comfortable working with it, and unless it's supported back in the communities of origin of those young people, it will simply remain in some cases only that I was on holiday together, I met somebody. Now those things are important in and of themselves, but they can reinforce difference if they're not handled properly. We also believe there needs to be a clarity in the definitions, and obviously we haven't put forward our response to the bill itself, and we note that there's a proposed definition of sharing, but I think whatever the definition is, it needs to be clear and concise. It needs to show what that is as opposed to integrated education, and it's our view that whatever it is, it should complement and not replace the duty to encourage and facilitate integrated education. We do believe that sharing in education can do a number of things. It can create an equality of opportunity which doesn't exist, depends on the postcode, depends on where you live, urban versus rural, whether young people do have an opportunity to have that engagement with the other. Now we know that's gender specific as well. 1 school in 6 is single sex here, and we know that boys tend to underperform in co-ed schools. They perform better when they're on their own, perform better in co-ed schools, whereas young women tend to perform better in single sex schools. So there's a whole range of things going in here when we talk about sharing. It also has a hugely important role to play in good relations. Now, in that, and Peter's already touched that, hopefully we'll be able to tease that out a little bit. It's not for us in the Commission to go over all the research that says when young people learn to work together and when they learn to respect difference, it doesn't mean difference disappears, but it means it put in a context of tolerance and understanding. When that happens, people's friendship patterns develop, people are more likely to have a more positive attitude to the other, and those things lead to people living lives where instead of parallel lives, they're much more integrated lives. It also, there's sustainability arguments, there's cost arguments, but we would argue that cost shouldn't drive this, but there are economic, social and educational benefits to sharing. We also know there's lots of experiences to be had from other jurisdictions and other places. I've often said that if a problem is here, it's been solved somewhere else. It's just we're not looking hard enough for it. So we shouldn't think what we're doing here is reinventing the wheel. There is huge experience in the shared education programme, in integrated schools, in some of the CRED programmes and in other jurisdictions. So we shouldn't be afraid to ask for help from outside, but also to cross-fertilise from within the system already. There is a huge need for us to engage with all the stakeholders, parents and pupils, educational providers, but particularly thinking of the youth service and those community relations and good relations workers who often have done this stuff. And sometimes the line between youth service, informal, and the formal educational service, there's a fault line in there at times. And I think there's a lot of benefit for the interface between those two. And finally, I started by saying this will not solve the inequalities of the educational system on its own. There remain, in our view, huge inequalities, and whether our view on, for example, the retention of academic selection, whether the removal of the Fair Employment and Treatment Orders exemption for teachers, teacher training, there's a whole raft of things in there. And look at the underperformance of looked after children, disabled children, BME children, boys versus girls, underachievement in loyalist working class communities, but also in some Catholic rural areas. Don't believe that this is going to solve everything, but it will begin, and it will, I think, and we've said in the Commission, if this is systemic, if it's real, if it's measured, but more importantly, it's not about programmes. And I think this needs to be measured in terms of outcomes, because no matter what we put in the system, people will just behave that way because the law's there. We need to be addressing the hearts and minds and the attitudes. And the outcome for this, its success will be measured in terms of its outcomes. Do the young people, as a result of this, learn how to live in citizenship better together?
Okay. Thank you very much. Peter, in CRC's submission, you're calling for a statutory duty on schools to promote good relations. How would that work in practice?
I think there's two or three underlying things around that. I think first of all, what we're saying is that the statutory duty is needed because there is a real need to focus people's effort, and a statutory duty is the best way of doing that. If something is legislated for in that way, then it I suppose focuses people's minds on what is required in the particular schools. I think it also would focus people around the actual means of delivery across various schools. And it would, I suppose, look at what that content might be across all of the different bodies and agencies that can contribute positively to that sort of delivery. I don't know if Dipney, you want to add to that?
I suppose in particular Section 75(2) fits neatly with the promotion of good relations and sharing across schools. So it's finding ways to support schools to be able to do that and fit within this programme as well. And the support programmes that have been going with alongside to support schools to deliver shared education. We find that there's schools that are engaged and have been engaged for some time in sharing in education, and there's others that aren't, some because of other competing priorities within just delivering the education system, but others perhaps with some resistance. So we feel that this isn't optional. We're in this the peace process together. So,
and have you done a particular study on how good relations are being applied in schools? Is there evidence of bad practice?
Sorry, Chair, I didn't catch the first part of the question.
Just having raised this as an issue, have you done sufficient research in order to qualify this request? Are there examples of bad practice in schools? You've mentioned that there is a certain reluctance under competing pressures. What type of evidence have you to support that?
I suppose the evidence is on the other end of the argument that those who have engaged in good relations programmes have done so very successfully, and the results have been very good, the contact has been good, the impact on the young people and indeed their communities and schools has been very good. So it's to try and ensure that for those who aren't sort of responding automatically to it and that they're engaged in it through some encouragement, if you like.
I think from what I've seen in schools that I've been to and teachers that I've spoken to, I suppose I'd want to put a lot more emphasis on some of the positive work that goes on, because there's a huge amount of positive work going on across all different schools from all different sectors around these issues, and I certainly wouldn't want to be suggesting that CRC is saying anything other than that. I think the organisation is about positively supporting that and encouraging more of that. I do also pick up, though, from some teachers and others involved in the education system that there is a wariness about doing this work, that there is a real view that one has to be very careful about it. There is a concern of putting one's foot in it in different ways. And so I think there is a need to really focus that work to help teachers themselves develop capacity, and there's an awful lot of capacity around this already, but further develop that capacity to be able to deliver this work. One person said to me a wee while ago that they thought the children were much more ready in some cases to do this than the teachers were, because the teachers maybe didn't have that background and training and training together, actually teacher to teacher from different traditions, in having that contact and knowing how to work it as effectively as it could. So I think the statutory duty will bring a greater focus to that, will put a greater obligation on schools to do it, but it also needs to be in a certain context where you're absolutely right, it's about supporting good practice and just trying to push that further and deeper down into the different schools.
Okay. You've also referred to the level of funding which is being invested in both shared and integrated education, and you've also equated that to the limited number of young people who have benefit from that. Do you have a concern about value for money in relation to that, and do you think that money could be spent differently in order to benefit a greater number of young people?
Sorry, value for money in terms of the sharing?
In terms of the money which is being spent on shared and integrated education, you focused on that in your paper, and you highlighted the limited number of young people who have benefited from that. Is there an issue around value for money, and do you think it could be spent better?
No, I think what the paper is suggesting, and again this is backed up by a lot of research, which is that children and young people benefit from learning and developing together. I think the work that goes on where that genuinely takes place with children from all sorts of different backgrounds, I think the research shows that they benefit from that, and they become much more rounded individuals and have change in terms of positive change in terms of their ability to learn and their ability to not just get a better academic qualification, but also learn in much more broader ways in terms of personality and attitudes and so on. And they then make that positive contribution back to society. So I think what the paper is suggesting is that we would actually like to see more children and young people learning and developing together in that way. I think it's absolutely right that there is a relatively small proportion of children benefiting from the shared and integrated models as they currently exist. The paper's highlighting that. I think the challenge for all of us is to try to get to that optimum model where more and more children and young people are learning and developing together. They will benefit from it, their education will benefit from it, our society is going to benefit from it as well.
Okay. You're obviously, you mentioned, Michael, in your presentation around the Article 64 and the obligation on integrated education, and you're saying that shared education would benefit from obviously having a clearly defined, and also that interrelationship with shared needs to be made much clearer. But you're saying that it shouldn't be replacing Article 64. Why not?
Well, at the minute, I think it's important to say there are two areas of the educational system where there's a duty to encourage and facilitate. That's Irish medium education through the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and then the 1989 order, which encourages and facilitates integrated education. So when you then bring this third non-sector as such, this is a type of education which a school can arguably work through a system to get a kite mark, let's say, to be a shared school. It's important, first of all, for us that definition is clear. What is a shared school? If you're, for example, two schools sharing a campus, is that enough to be a shared school? So we're actually saying, first of all, there should be a clarity of definition. Now, if you're then putting that into a bill where there is either a duty or a power, now we haven't responded to this yet, whether there should or shouldn't be, but what we are clear about is there are parents who want a formally integrated school. There is the duty on the department to encourage and facilitate that at the moment. If there then is a comparable duty to come in, we would see those as running as complementary, and would not want to see shared education as some substitute for or replacement for formally integrated schools. So I think what we're saying is there's room for both, and include, of course, the Irish language, which also is encourage and facilitate.
Does the duty, which relates obviously to both integrated and Irish medium, not create a hierarchy of sectors?
Well, we haven't, and because the Equality Commission doesn't have a view on whether it creates a hierarchy as such or not. But when we're going in to do the response to the bill, what we will be considering is, should there be a duty or should it be a power? And that will allow us to look at the other duties and powers that there are at the minute. So if I were to say something that would be my personal view, and I don't want to do that because as a Commission we don't have a considered view, but it is there, and our view at the minute is, if you're bringing in shared education and there becomes a duty or a power to do that, it should not be at the cost of the formally integrated sector, which at the minute has a duty to encourage and facilitate on the part of the Department of Education. Do you want to add anything?
No, that was the view of the Commission, was that it wouldn't be at the cost of, that parental choice was being facilitated to access integrated education if it so wished. If we wanted to move into further into shared education, that could be in addition to that provision, and certainly the focus of sharing between sectors that's been discussed would allow the sharing between the integrated and other sectors as well. So in addition to that.
I think the important thing is the duty to encourage and facilitate is to bring together in roughly equal proportions Protestants and Catholics, and out of that comes the formally integrated school. But of course transformed schools have also carried out the same duty, so this isn't about a structure, but it's about a type of education. Shared education seems to be similarly saying there is a product that we're going to call shared education, and we're saying that needs to be clearly defined, but it is not the same thing as integrated education. And therefore there needs to be the clear delineation between the two.
Okay, and just with regards to barriers, you mentioned teacher training. in order to advance shared education. Would you perhaps develop that?
Well, I think what we're saying is there are a number of areas, fault lines, if you like, within education at the minute that we don't believe contribute to the best possible sharing we can have. Now, we're agnostic in terms of what the teacher training looks like at the moment. But what we did say, if you remember when Stranmillis and Queen's were moving towards a merger, was that it would be unfortunate if that became the case, because then there would be St Mary's College over here, and if you like, I'm being shorthand here, a larger so-called Protestant training college. What we're saying is you should be looking at the opportunities to maximise sharing when teachers are being formally trained. And alongside that, we've asked for the removal of the exemption from teachers from Fair Employment and Treatment Order. So those two things together act in that sense as barriers. So we're saying optimise the potential for teachers to be trained together. And
you'll obviously be aware, obviously it's outside of this
Sure.
committee's remit, but there's obviously ongoing discussions in relation to finance and the impact that's going to have on St Mary's and Stranmillis and their future. But there are opportunities, obviously, if we are serious about shared education, then about looking at it
and I think,
sharing with
Chair, there are other things that are happening where teachers are being trained together in CPD, you know, so when the early professional development and also the ongoing professional development, it's quite common within the Education Library Boards, teachers are trained together, so it's not as if this is a new thing. And very often you will have teachers from so-called Protestant background actually doing teacher training in so-called Catholic schools. So this does happen. It is not the norm. So what I said earlier is this is actually happening in places. So it's actually trying to say, how do we make that happen? Is it incentivisation? But I think the system as such, how it's set up, must follow the function. We would like more sharing. We would like there to be less fault lines. And then if you like, what would the system look like to be able to best facilitate that?
Thank you very much. Mr. Kinahan.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thank you very much for the presentation. And Peter, it was great to hear. And I think a lot of us forget that all the positive work that you say is going on all the time. We forget that, and often the divisions are more here than anywhere else. I've got 2 or 3 questions that thinking you talk about having clearly defined goals of where you're going, and yet when you look at the definition that is coming through in the shared bill, it's calling for people to be defined either Catholic or Protestant or in a socio-economic group. Do we not need it more blurred so that we can get the mixed communities involved in it? Because if you literally have set definitions of what one is, people are going to have to fit into one or the other to be able to avail of the funding that allows them to have shared schooling.
Well, we will be responding specifically to what the bill is putting forward. So I can't say what the Commission's view will be, but let me give you some of the background to it. As it sits in the education system already, schools are asked to respond on a pupil census in 5 headings. So this is already captured. The integrated sector is asked from day one to ask parents to designate a child Protestant, Catholic or other. And if it doesn't do that, you can't prove that there is a minority tradition of 30%. So there's a sense in which, in the same way, when we track for participation in the workforce, we've asked since the 1970s the workforce to capture its figures on those broad terms as well. So this is actually part of what we do. Would it be in the future a thing that we would like not to have? It would be great in an ideal world that that's not there. But if we're trying to say there needs to be mixing, we need some evidence of how we know that's happening. Now, we know that on one measure there's up to 20% people say they're neither. Now, quite what that's saying about denominations, we're not sure. But in addition to that, there's a concern, well, not a concern, there's an issue we would have about when you have on the bill and, so you have religious and political and then basically socio-economic, how do you measure that? For example, since the new measure of social benefit has come in, I think the grammar school, free school meals has jumped from 7 to 12%. So there's something about how we measure disadvantage. Is it FSM? Is it, in receipt of some type of welfare? Is it geographic location? So there are some indeterminates, I guess, for us. But if what we're saying is this system is meant to be saying sharing is not just Protestant, Catholic, if I use the old headlines, but it's also, again, we'll call it class. It's how you would measure that and what that's actually saying about your end game. Because is it meaning then effectively grammars have to go with non-grammars if we're being like that, or a rural school with an urban school? I found it difficult, I think, when I was looking at the bill to try to find out what that was actually saying. So your question, Danny, begs the question about what is it we're trying to measure? Mm-hmm. And if we're trying to measure X, then you need to have a way of data collecting X. But this isn't about numbers. This is actually about whether relationships are built that are sustainable, and whether at the end of it the young people's attitudes are in some way developed so that they're more at ease with difference. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, as Michael said, the Commission hasn't formed a view on the policy or the bill, but certainly within those documents, you know, there are questions arising. Are you looking really to share between sectors, or are you looking to share between the individual backgrounds of pupils? There's an issue there to be resolved. You talk about being wider. Obviously, the policy talks about the importance of sharing between mainstream schools and special schools. So obviously that would fall out with the definition. So there are clearly some things to be worked through there in what the bill's looking at and what the policy's looking at.
Briefly, can I just add a little bit to that? And like the Equality Commission, the Community Relations Council will be considering its formal response over the next number of weeks, so we don't have a formal stated position on that. It seems to me, though, that what the bill does is identify two of the big issues that we need to tackle around education. I think that's a positive thing. The Community Relations Council produced its Peace Monitor report earlier this year, which highlighted really significant educational underachievement linked into disadvantage, particularly with Protestant working class boys, but also with Catholic working class boys. It's across the community divide in different areas. If we don't tackle that, we will be storing up issues related to community cohesion in this society for many years to come. It is a big issue, and the fact that it's there within the bill is important. It's important also that within the bill there is a recognition of the dual system, I suppose, in terms of how we educate our young people here. And I think the need to move to an optimum model where children and young people learn and develop together is critically important. I think the issue for yourselves, as well as for everybody else within civil society, is to ensure that what happens next is sufficiently robust to ensure sufficient movement on all of those issues. I think that when it comes to disadvantage is quite clear, and part of that is linked to investment in those areas where that disadvantage is clear, investment in the schools in those areas. Across the water there is a pupil premium paid for schools that have kids that are entitled to free school meals. That's the sort of thing that we might need to consider here even more vigorously than we currently are. And that's an investment on both sides of the community, and the CRC's report earlier last year demonstrated that. In terms of the issue of Protestant, Catholic and people from different community backgrounds, I think it's important to acknowledge that, and the focus needs to be to have the courage to change the systems that we have in order to ensure that there is that optimum model of people learning and sharing and developing together. And that is about the milestones and the targets. Because what this is about isn't about kids being, it's not about buildings. It's not about structures, it's not about forms, or it's not about which system we support. This is about what is best for children and young people and this society, and that's what needs to drive us as the primary focus in anything that we do.
May I just add one thing? It's important, and Peter picked this up. As I read the bill, it reads almost as this is about integrating systems and joining up systems. And a lot of the measures seem to be about numbers and about projects. And you need to search far to find out about attitudinal change in young people. Now, if we're saying shared education is a system as opposed to a product, and I think there's an important difference here. You know, integrated education is both a set of schools, but it's a type of education that I would argue could take place in other places if the same conditions apply. So if shared education is saying it's maximising mixing between socioeconomic groups, Protestant, Catholic and other, but we're saying that that's limited simply to a Protestant and a Catholic school coming together, I think we sell this short. Yeah. I think this is about optimising the opportunities there are for this interaction to take place, that shared education therefore is both a system, a way, but it's more than that, it's a way of doing it. It's the relationship building, and that's, I think, the brand rather than the type of the system that supports it.
One more. You talked through that. I mean, what I was really after is looking for some form of flexibility, but we're talking all the way through on how we measure future. I mean, measuring the outcomes is the hardest thing of the lot. How do you see us measuring the outcomes in the way that you spoke right at the beginning?
Well, look, very, very simply, there is a huge amount of experience out there from integrated schools, from youth work, from IFI AP funded programmes, from self-inspecting schools to show how you develop attitudinal change. You can see it in race, you can see it in disability. It is possible to measure the attitudinal development of a young person or older person from point A to point B. You simply need to capture the start point and look at how it develops. Young people can write portfolios, they can take there are all sorts of creative ways. It has been done. So I don't think we need to worry about reinventing the wheel. Schools are now much more self-examining. They know where their benchmarks are. They know how to demonstrate success. But the most important people are the young people themselves. They can tell you and give you examples of how they've actually changed as a result of that engagement. So I don't think it's something to be frightened of, but I think teachers need to learn how it happens. We need to look for where it is and bring it in. So I'm less concerned about that because I do think it's there. In youth work, it's been there for about 25 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Dibna.
Yeah, I mean, the overall kind of project piece, we're looking at, if you look at the entire Together Building United Community project, you're looking at bringing down barriers and interfaces, shared education, shared housing, etc. So some of the measures will have to go into the good relations indicators for future generations. You know, if we're working with our young people, they are the next generations who are going to be living in shared housing. They're going to have to help us prepare to live in a society without barriers. And so it's attitudinal change is one thing, but looking at how we actually progress and kind of dismantle, if you like, the whole structure of segregation and work towards integration and a more normalised society within our peace process, that's also critical. So I would suggest that when we're looking at shared education, we also link in to the other programmes and priority areas and key headline actions within TBUC to see how it all fits in. And we're also talking about young people, and not in isolation. Many of them go back into communities that they're going to need support to be able to be the peace builders we want them to be, because their communities sometimes inhibit that. There's just a whole joined upness that you can measure young people and you can measure their schools and the teacher training, but it's actually how our society and young people within that move forward collectively as well as.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Craig.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose I should welcome the Trojan horse into the room, as some others described the equality agenda. That's tongue-in-cheek, by the way. The Commission, I was reading here, the Commission is arguing that really the rights of parents to select faith-based schools should not be allowed to overshadow the importance of education and mixing good relations. I would like some understanding of exactly what is meant by that, and hopefully this isn't what would be seen as another attack on a person's faith. For a number of reasons for asking that, because not all faith-based schools aren't mixed. You know, we were at Methody College a number of weeks ago, which is almost 50-50 when you go to Catholic and Protestant. In my own constituency, you also have Friends School in Lisburn, and it's about 40-60% there. So it doesn't necessarily mean not mixed in a faith-based school. What exactly is the Commission getting at there?
Well, let me say first of all, the context, we've predicated this on two things. That the child has to be at the centre of this. And secondly, that we still accept the parental choice. Now, I know because of the way demography works, the way money works, parental choice in some areas, accessing what may be seen as a good school, is something around postcode, and that's just stating what happens. So parental choice isn't absolute, and it doesn't work that way, but parental choice is at the core of our educational system, and we wouldn't want to diminish that. Nor would we want to diminish the fact that there are systems in place, and we're not arguing for one system and doing away with faith-based education. So this is not to say that faith-based is any less than non-faith-based or a secular system, which, as you know, we don't have. We have church-related schools in the control system where you have the transfers reps still on the boards of governors. You have probably more a faith-related system within the Catholic system, whereas the integrated system is actually essentially Christian in character. We actually don't have what may be in other places, non-faith schools or secular schools. So you shouldn't read anything in this to say there is any sense where the Commission wants to diminish the rights of parents to choose a form of education, whether that's faith-based or within other sectors. Do you want to amplify just on the specific point?
Yeah, I think you've covered most of it. Certainly, the Commission recognising parental choice, absolutely, for whatever school the parent would be interested in. But the point behind it was that it shouldn't impact on the system as a whole being focused on sharing. And certainly the commitments within things like TBUC, talking about sharing become a central part of the system, and that it impacting on every child's educational experience, are very key and similar to the Commission's interests and concerns there. So it's really just the point that we wanted to ensure that sharing was central to the system as a whole.
And I think absolutely, Jonathan, if you take, for example, Catholic maintained schools, less than 1% of children attending would be designated non-Catholic, and about half of those Protestant. It would be totally wrong to say that Catholic schools do not support and promote good relations. Some Catholic schools have 50, 40% Protestants at them, granted a very small number, but the mix of the children attending is not the only parameter in which you can measure someone's intention to mix. So simply because they are designated Catholic and attended by mostly Catholic doesn't preclude them from any form of mixing, and you shouldn't read anything in this, and if there's an ambiguity, we'll correct that. This is saying parental choice lies at its core. But parental choice, as we know, is limited by geographic location, but it's also limited by money. What we're saying is that systems are there, but if we're looking at sharing in education, that should be the core, as TBUC says. And if that gets in the way of people, if systems get in the way of that as an excuse, then that needs to be challenged. But it's not to say that if you're in a faith-based school, you're any less capable or able to share. Absolutely not. In fact, the contrary is the case in many cases, and you've cited some of them.
Is there an underlying thought, though, behind this, that there should be some form of almost forced integration? You know, because I've seen better experiences of this in communities where it literally backfires if you try and force integration. Integration is something which comes about through almost a natural process, almost, where parents and pupils make their own mind up on that issue.
I think, Jonathan, the important thing is sharing's the term and not integration, and this is why we're saying there needs to be a difference. We have always argued that voluntarism lies at the centre of this. The problem is you can only choose something if it's there. So lots of people want to live in mixed housing, but they're still living separately because there isn't an opportunity. So there's something about demand and supply, and there needs to be a match to people's desire, volunteering, wanting to be in a shared system, a shared education, and at the minute that isn't there. So there needs to be something, that may be in the systems, it may be a systemic answer as well. But what we're not saying is people should be forced to integrate. We are saying children should have the opportunity to share, and that should be core to the educational system.
Chair, if I could add one or two things as well, and it goes back to something that we touched on earlier in the discussion. There is, and I know it because I've seen some of it directly, as I'm sure members have as well, a huge amount of positive and brave work going on in schools across the community divide. Certainly would want to highlight and commend the schools for doing that rather than anything else. I think we do need to recognise that when it happens. You mentioned, Jonathan, a few schools yourself. On the Catholic maintained side, the same thing happens. There is an awful lot of learning and developing together that the children do. At the same time, there is an awful lot of education going on where children and young people aren't learning together, aren't developing together. And I think that issue goes to the heart of where we need to progress as a society. And what we have talked about is not a particular model, it is about optimising a model for that learning and developing for children and young people together. And we have to face certain questions. I mean, for example, the TBUC strategy, I think, is very ambitious in saying let's take down interface barriers and peace walls. Well, there are a number of factors that are important in taking those interface barriers down. If we are genuinely wanting to achieve that, we need to look at the safety and security that people feel on either side. We need to look at an inclusive process where there aren't gatekeepers. We need to look at the regeneration of those areas. But maybe paramount is we need to look at relationship building across those peace walls. Well, if what we're doing is perpetuating a system, and this isn't about some of the schools that you've mentioned maybe, but perpetuating a system in North and West and East Belfast and Portadown and Derry, Londonderry, where kids from one side of that interface fence never meet the kids from the other side of the interface fence, don't do any genuine learning and developing together, the depth of their contact is pretty shallow, then I know what we'll get in 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years' time. We'll get the same attitudes, because they'll be parents of children in 20 and 30 years' time. We'll get the interface barriers still there. So if we really aspire as a society, and OFM DFM's T-Box strategy says that we do, to take down those barriers, if we really aspire to shared housing, then we need to have the courage to change how this system operates. I'm not saying it's one system or another, because this is not about systems, it's not about structures, it's not about forms, it's about, in our hearts and in our heads and how we approach this issue, knowing that change is needed of how we get children to learn and develop together. And if we do that, and we approach that, on that basis, which I think we all know is the right basis on how to approach this, then we will develop a greater continuum of change within the education sector that we have.
Chair, I don't think there's anybody arguing about the concept. I think the practicalities sometimes just don't work out on the ground, and I think that's where you're almost into the mindset of the people in an area itself. Are they ready for that change? Some areas are, some areas aren't. I've had that better experience myself locally when you talked about shared housing. But I think where we're going with on this shared education thing is resources, or the lack of resources, if we're being honest about it, is going to drive us down this route no matter what. Because if there isn't enough finance there to provide 2 separate schools, and there's only enough finance there to provide 1 single building, and you have a maintained school and a controlled school, well, the answer is staring us in the face. That's where shared education is driving this. The resources may well bring about the shared educational experience that we're talking about here. And I've seen an example of that in my own constituency when it came to the area learning community network around A-levels, because that's precisely what has occurred, because of a lack of resources.
Could I say, Chair, there's an issue in here that the danger is that people will be forced into sharing or integration. Now, if you look at the integrated sector, there's been an argument for a long time that schools choose to transform because they're failing schools. Tests were put in to make sure that didn't take place. It would be a terrible thing if people felt, sharing was only an option for closing down a school. We argued that communities should be involved in this. There's one example in Omagh a number of years ago where a deliberative poll was taking place, where parents were actually polled before, during and after a process about more sharing in the Omagh area. And what actually happened in that area was parents were not aware of what opportunities they had. So to envisage something different, to have that moral imagination, you actually need to know what you can do. And sometimes we actually think maybe communities aren't ready. ICR did a piece of research in North Belfast looking at the potential for sharing. And what it discovered was that parents choose a school because of its geography, because of conflict, because of its location to a wall, because it's a good school. When you talk to them about sharing, they were actually up for it, but those were the barriers in their minds as well as the big barriers. But there are ways of actually ameliorating that, mitigating against it. And they're out there. There are schools that are actually working this through. This is not, Jonathan, something parachuting down, and heaven help us if parents think they're being somehow manipulated into this. This is why community planning is core to this and key to this. It's not just within the educational service. It's about how we have shared opportunities, and that permeates everything, not just education.
Sorry, briefly, if I can, just 2 other points around that. Jonathan, I think you're right in terms of attitudes in local areas. I agree with Michael as well. When I talk to people in those areas, I think there is more of a willingness to change than we maybe appreciate. I have to say, I think that it can be encouraged when other people in public life find the courage to say themselves what they really think on some of these issues and encourage that change in people's minds at a local level. All of us, whether it be elected representatives or other members of civil society, I think it's important that voice is heard, is actually vocalised and then heard, because that makes change easier. And I think in terms of the shared education side of things, there may be many pressures that lead down a particular road. I think there's research in other areas which shows that where you have one building and that building is used in a segregated way, it actually makes the situation worse. I've heard of some buildings where one particular community goes in one entrance and the other community goes in another entrance. I've heard of something where a sports pitch is used by one community in the morning and the other community in the afternoon. It reinforces segregation. It reinforces mindsets and attitudes. And that's why I think the issue here is not about structures or systems or forms or buildings. It is about the needs of the children and young people in our society, and it's where the continuum and the milestones and the targets are really important here as we push this into a better place around learning and developing together.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Hazard.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for the presentation so far. It's been really interesting. Just to pick up on a couple of the later points there, to play devil advocate, I suppose, a bit, should we not be forcing parents a wee bit more, and even around parental choice? If parents still decide to choose a faith-based education, well then how far are we going to actually get? What you're saying there, I take on board the issue around attitudes in society, but should we not be saying to them, look, it's 2015, this is the best way forward? Like the Donaldson report into health is telling us that we need to make some hard decisions, and Peter, you said yourself that we shouldn't avoid asking the hard questions, but yet in education, and again I'm playing devil's advocate here to a certain extent, parties and people always fall back on parental choice. Would you agree with that? To a certain extent, is parental choice the get-out clause for people says, well, we can't go ahead, the minister can't go ahead of what communities want. Is there an argument that says if we always say that, then we're not actually going to advance?
That's an interesting point. Our experience working in lots of different areas in relation to breaking down barriers and all sorts of different segregation has been that the important part of the work is creating the conditions. And the parental choice part, sometimes the word choice is key here. Is there a choice for people living in single identity areas quite often to do that, take that step? We need to create the conditions. And I take Michael's point about giving people enough information. People on the ground, they live in conditions, they're used to it. They're not thinking beyond that because they're not being inspired, if you like, or that the conditions aren't being created for them to consider, could there be a better way, a future for our children, a different way forward? What are they? They may come to the same conclusion that they don't want that, or they may, when they get the right information, consider different options. But I think there's a lack of information on the ground and an engagement with those parents in making those decisions quite often, and we need to work harder at that as well.
But I think we need to get our heads around this, that we're sending mixed messages to parents, and that a parent sitting at home values their choice that they have, and then when they make that choice, they hear that they're, institutionalising benign apartheid or it's segregation, and they're saying, hold on, I've made a choice. The system cherishes choice. So, I can't help but think that unless we really tackle this issue of choice, and, and I myself am not even sure on it, is the choice right? Do we need to start pushing communities down a particular path? Because again, I can't get away from the idea that, is our default position that the system is right for offering choice, or is our default position that our system reflects, tensions in society so that the system itself is broke? And how do we start to put it together? But again, if we start to talk about choice, then parents will always choose faith-based education. They will always choose integrated. They will always choose Irish medium. So you're always going to have that, and some people describe it as segregation, some people describe it as benign apartheid, and we'll always get back to square one. So I can't help but think, various sections here are on different roads. Some of it is shared education between these various sectors. Some people see the end as an entirely integrated section. I just think there is confusion going down to parents. There's parents choosing schools at the minute, and the vast majority of them, won't choose integrated. But that doesn't mean that they're not supporting societies coming together. I don't know if there's a question in there, or if that's just ramblings. But
well, I think a couple probably of a rambled response. I don't think it was a rambled question, but I'll give you a rambled response. I think there are a lot of factors why parents choose schools for their children, and I'm not sure you can never really get away from parental choice in that sense, because I'm a parent myself, and there will be a number of factors that go into our choice of school whenever our son gets to that age. And some of those factors are reflected in the bill. Some of it is about the personal development of children as they mix with people from different backgrounds and different gender, for example, and all sorts of factors that will go into that choice. So I think it is important to have that choice. I think what the Life and Time survey shows repeatedly is that a vast majority of people in this society do want more sharing in the schools, where young people and children learn and develop together. I mean, I think it's 80% plus, if my memory serves me right, of what the Life and Time survey says. So I'm not sure there are many parents whose principal objective or principal choice will be about whether a child goes to school with people from one side of the community or another side of the community. The statistics don't necessarily reflect that. And there are just multiple reasons why parents would make a particular choice about what school a child would go to. I think there is an obligation on people in leadership positions, obviously in legislative chambers like this, in organisations like the Equality Commission or CRC or others, to shape what that, I don't want to get into systems, but shape what that model is in order to benefit the child and young person and therefore benefit society as a whole. And I think in trying to shape that, I don't think you can get away from that just underlying core principle about the child and the young person sharing, learning and developing together. If that drives what that model is, I think it's going to be a model that almost all parents will buy into.
Sorry, Chair. I think it's also important to add that you can separate out the difference between parental choice regarding an individual school from a sector which has sharing at its core, and therefore would want to encourage sharing between those schools or within those schools, if that is sort of either joint management or integrated. So I think you can have those two separate things. And again, back to that commitment into Buck, where sharing becomes a central part of every child's commitment, and then that's really saying that if it's every child, it means it's every school. And therefore, back to the question earlier, it's about how you incentivise, how you recognise that there is a continuum and how you move that to be the norm within the system, therefore allowing the choice but still having a system which is pro-sharing.
May I add just one thing? There's something that I think we need to address is the system is not set in concrete. The system leaks. The system is porous, and we should maximise that nature of being porous. So, for example, in other jurisdictions they have federations. They bring schools together under one head teacher. There are multiple ways. They have joint faith schools, they have joint church schools, they have sixth form colleges attached to 2 other colleges. There are models of systems that say the end is here. How do we get to the end? Let's fix the system to suit the outcome. Now, we have 1,200 schools. We've probably, in some estimates, 300 schools too many. We've 500 schools that have 100 or less children in them. Now, this is part of how we've been in this place. We have a separate system. The nature of the state, how we've come here, is another issue. We can't simply delete 1,200 schools. But what we can say is, how do we work within that system to make it leak more? How do we make each parent, wherever they are, have access, if they want it, to an integrated or an Irish language or faith-based school? But more importantly, when they buy into that, how can we ensure that at the core, the DNA is sharing? That's the test. It's not about the systems. It's about ensuring that there's no postcode lottery in this, that parents have that access and young people have that opportunity. Buck promises it.
Just 2 final points. Really, one's linked, I suppose, is this idea that, do we leave it to communities to lead the way, or should the department perhaps enforce more change top down? I'm thinking here that, and for me, the 3 big issues that come out of this is academic selection, it's teacher training, and it's what we're talking about here, the integration or shared, the model of education. Do you feel that perhaps it needs to be more top-down control on these issues? There needs to be more political agreement on these issues to drive these things forward? And the second point is actually back on to the academic selection and the effect on community cohesion that has. And I know you referenced Dundonald High, and if you talk to Ken Perry down there, he will say the greatest harm to that school was the effect of academic selection in that community in East Belfast. So again, I would just perhaps like your thoughts on just that.
I'll give you a very personal reflection in some way and then go on to the general. I failed my 11 plus. I have had a brother's no longer with us now who went to Dundonald High, who also failed his 11 plus. I failed my 11 plus because I was too young, I think, when I took it. If I'd been 6 months older, I might have passed it. So the pass or failure of an 11 plus doesn't necessarily direct you in terms of the rest of your life, but it certainly has a big impact. I'm not sure that is the best way to treat children when they're 10 and 11 years old. And again, I think that goes back to whether there are some people and kids being failed by the system. I'm not necessarily a fan of 11 plus, but I also understand the need to give children and young people the best education that they possibly can. I also think that we need to try to get an agreed way forward around this, because the children and young people are at the core of this. And I think some of the things that the children and young people are having to go through at the minute is not reasonable. And they are the reason why policy should be made around this issue. I think around the other thing about Dundonald High School is it is really interesting whenever the community got much more involved in the board that it significantly helped the school. I think there is a vibrancy about getting more people involved in boards, about making how communities are really engaged in schools through the boards. It's really important, I think, for schools going forward. And I think there's something around how that just happens between schools and communities that we do need to reflect on. I think that gave us an example of how positive that sort of change can be whenever communities really get involved in the management of their schools. In terms of teacher training, you know, I'm not sure we can expect our children and young people to do something if, as adults and teachers, we don't do it ourselves. I am aware of situations where children and young people are willing to get involved in some significant hard issues and questions and dialogue with each other, and many teachers who facilitate that, but I'm aware of situations where teachers are reluctant to facilitate it, and I suspect that's because the teachers themselves have not gone through the training and the capacity building that is needed to engage in those sort of sessions. And I think that does go back to relationships and it goes back to our courage to make change happen in a way that we know is needed in this society and is needed for our children and young people, around teacher training and around just the general relationships of kids across the community divide. Sorry, you wanted to...
I mean, just very simply, we have, as a Commission, obviously made our sort of points in terms of academic selection, but fixing it is not going to fix the system. You know, you divide the education system 7 ways here: Protestant, Catholic, boys and girls, those who pass, those who don't, Irish language, integrated, hospital skills, special skills, have probably about 10 ways in a jurisdiction of 1.8 million. Now, we wouldn't start from here, but we're here. So how do we actually do what we can do to make sure that if you think of young Protestant males down here who are in a non-grammar school and young Catholic females at a girls' grammar school up here, there is something wrong if, when we look consistently at outcomes for looked after children, BME, we look at disabled and boys and girls, when we look at that and we see the system it doesn't come out with equal outcomes. So either something's going wrong with the method of teaching, which I don't believe it is, or we need to look at the system to make it more, not just the equality of opportunity, but we're looking at how within that system we make sure that not only is sharing there, but that those young people are enabled to fulfil their potential. And at the minute, if you go to a non-grammar school, there is an expectation sometimes on young people, I won't perform. It's a poverty of aspiration. And some people then have to overperform to get there. So we shouldn't be simply saying one's bad and one's good schools. What we have said in the Commission is we should be looking at every child should be able to get a good quality education. Now, if that means changing the systems at the end of it, absolutely. But I think we're talking today specifically about sharing, and I guess what we're saying is there's also the socio-economic thing about sharing in this, which you've identified in the bill.
Okay,
thank you.
Mr. Lunn.
Thanks, Chair. Good to see you all. Peter, you mentioned the community situation of some hall with separate entrances for different traditions. On the basis of that, what's your view about one of the department's shared education programmes, which is the situation in the Moy, where the proposal is to set up one school to replace 2, one from each tradition, but effectively keep the pupils separate?
It seems to me you go back again to why something is being done and the benefits of children and young people learning and developing together. I wouldn't necessarily say the proposals for the MOI, and I'm probably not as aware of the detail of them as you have. I know a bit about it. I'm not sure I would necessarily say the proposals in the MOI are a bad thing, depending on what happens over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years as that facility develops. This isn't about buildings. It is about the needs of the children and young people and the society at large. And therefore, if there are milestones and a real focus around the continuum of change in that community, then you may have a successful intervention there. But if it is just about 2 separate schools and 1 building and everything is separate going forward, and in 10 years' time the kids still have no contact in terms of learning and developing together, then you have to wonder whether, while there may have been an economic benefit of 1 facility, whether we really are optimising the benefit to that local community of the children developing better relationships with each other.
May I just feed into this? We obviously don't have a view on whether it's good, bad or indifferent, but let me say what our principles are. When you're looking at an act of generosity that seems on the face of things to be one community saying to the other community, your school could go, and if saving your school means you can share a campus with us, that seems to me to be a reasonable act of generosity. And I've worked in single identity communities that are really want and thirsty to work with the other, but this is a journey, it's not a destination. So if you're saying, is that the end game? It can't be the end game, and we're saying that sharing has to be systemic, it has to go to the core. But if the alternative to that is that one tradition loses its school, and you know what happens in communities if they lose, the railway station, the post office, and then eventually the school, those communities leak. One of the arguments for setting up the integrated school in the Cuts in Derryaghy was the Protestant community were feeling that there was a loss, and rather than loss of school, they were happy to have a transformed school there. So this is more than simply having a school. If it's saying an act of generosity took place, I think that's a good starting point. Now, this is what we said at the top of this. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. The buddying schemes, the shared campuses, but it can't simply be left there. The research in Scotland seems to say shared campuses can actually reinforce division rather than actually promote sharing. If teachers go into separate doors, they have different times that they're timetabled. If it's, however, a place to start formal sharing, it should be open for the generous act that it is. I mean, this is my own personal view drawn on what we're saying, I think, within the Commission around the nature of sharing. Would that be fair?
Yeah, again, for us, I think we can separate the sharing of facilities from the sharing of curriculum and the sharing of classes, and the Commission is very clear that it wants to see sharing mainstream for every pupil, shared curriculum, shared classes.
And just in conclusion to that, from community relations perspective, our interest would be in the quality of the sharing and the impact of the sharing, the learning from it, and how it's rolled out, where it's working, and indeed where it's not working, how we can improve on it.
Thank you all for that. The situation in the MOI is that a community survey was done. 85 responses were in favour of what is actually now proposed. 70 were in favour of an integrated solution, and 5 didn't want anything to do with any of it. It seems to me that if the influence of CCMS came into play very heavily here, and because CCMS have set their face very firmly in front of this committee against any attempt to integrate a maintained school in another sector. They're absolutely adamant about it. Now, if you compare that to the situation which is now developing in the Republic, it's obviously they've taken it. Well, they don't have CCMS, but they have a different structure, and it's now become obvious that the Catholic Church, who run most of the schools down there, have now realised that their position is not sustainable. And Educate Together, who you've probably heard of, are now coming into play in a big way. Do you think that CCMS's attitude, and I know I'm inviting controversy, but do you think that their attitude is sustainable or realistic?
Okay, first of all, I don't want to comment on CCMS's attitude because for 15 years I was Director of Integrated Education, so I actually understand their situation. They've been very clear that a Catholic school, if it becomes an integrated school, can no longer be a Catholic school. So if that's their working premise, I understand why the outworking of that is what they say. So what we're saying here is, if we're asking a community, how do we actually have a shared educational system? When we go through an EQIA, and we get a community response, we're always clear that the numbers are not the only thing that determine the outcome. The numbers are one measurement in the toolkit. And so there's something about full involvement of communities, and we've said this in our response. If you're looking at sharing in a community, this shouldn't be just simply a vote on something. It should be much more around community engagement, around outcomes involving the young people. And ways to do this are actually, we know how to do this in this place. So I don't know the background to the MOI. I'm simply saying that we know that in other places the communities maybe don't get the voice. And one of the things we've said on our inequalities is too often that civic voice is lost. Too often we hear so-called gatekeepers saying things. Community planning allows us a way in there. But this has to be a long-term solution where we say what's best for that community. I don't know enough about the case, and I'm not denying anything Trevor says here, Chair. I'm simply saying that this should move beyond systems. It should move beyond, CCMS and the control sector. This should be about how we best make a shared establishment for the young people in that area. And if that's in 2 schools sharing or 1 school sharing, that's for the community to decide.
Let me just tell you something about the case then. Because originally CCMS opposed this adamantly. The first instruction they gave to the maintained school down there was to withdraw from all discussions and take nothing whatever to do with it. So they have at least moved in some direction. But what they've come up with is a solution which could only frankly happen in Northern Ireland. This is going to be a school with 2 boards of governors under one roof, separate classes, 1 entrance, separate uniforms. And the only hope for it from my point of view would be that it actually leads somewhere, which is the point you made, Peter, and maybe 20 years down the line, the good sense may prevail. But to me it was a golden opportunity and Chris mentioned the possibility of a wee bit of pressure being applied in some situations. But this was a situation where almost half of the parents were canvassed, agreed that an integrated solution was the obvious one. To some of us, it is the obvious one. And this is not to say that I don't agree with faith schools, believe me. If it comes back to parental choice, if parents want to continue to use faith schools, although with the diminishing level of faith perhaps in this country, that may have to change as well, as has happened in the Republic. And just to take issue with something Jonathan said, that he's back, I always correct him on Methody. The situation in Methody is that 45% Protestant, 25% Catholic, and a telling figure of 30% unattached, if I might use that term. But Methody is a terrific school, and a very good example of how things can develop.
Just one thing in this. It will be interesting to see, leaving aside the nature of the structure, if the bill became law, the definition of shared education could be one applied to the school. Because this is actually about the outcomes. And if that type of educational establishment over time were able to deliver what we define as shared education, which is wide and deep and intense and intentional, then the judgment, if you like, is taken by the outcomes, by the measurement. I understand what Trevor's saying. It's not to me to comment about what a community has done there, because I'm not quite sure where that's going at the minute, because I've only seen what's in public discourse. I think what we would say again, though, is the core of this has to be the outcome for the young person. And if this is about shared outcomes where young people really get to learn about the other, and that's facilitated well, then that's what this is about, rather than the systems.
And just 2 other things in response. And I don't know the detail as well as Trevor. One thing that occurs to me is there is a real need for the benefits of the outcomes that we're talking about, because the focus needs to be here not on structures or systems or form. It is about what the needs of the children and young people are, and it seems to me there is a a significant discussion and debate needed about why learning and share and developing together is good for those children and young people. And I don't think I've met a parent yet who doesn't want the best for their child. And I think that debate and discussion is something that might inform a lot of communities going forward about what is actually in the best interests of the child and young people. And one other thing that occurs to me when you mention Methody, but I think this is true in many schools, is of course we're not dealing with a monoculture in a sense of Protestant and Catholic. I mean, that's not just the only issue we're dealing with here. We are living in a very multicultural society, and I think Methody and many other schools are examples where people from all sorts of different faiths and backgrounds are being schooled, and again reinforcing the benefits of everybody across this community learning and developing together, learning about others and learning the importance of living in this sort of multicultural society.
Just one more, if you don't mind. I've got about 10 more, but one will do. The departmental drivers of the shared education programme were with us there a few weeks ago, and they were absolutely clear in their own mind that, as far as they're concerned, the aim of shared education is educational, and if there are societal benefits, that's a spin-off. Frankly, that's a bonus. I hope is a big bonus, but let's wait and see. Well, what's your view about that? Because from your point of view, I would have thought you were more interested in the societal side.
I can understand how.
Equally
I read the submission,
Yeah.
and I mean, there's always been the issue for me about what's the purpose of education, and is it simply to create young people to go to university or to create jobs? Absolutely not. I mean, Latin educare, to draw out. The whole purpose of education is to draw out, not to put in. I mean, it's both, but naturally it's to draw out from young people. Now, when that best education takes place, then there are societal benefits. And to say somehow education is what I heard them say a little bit reading that was this is an academic process, i.e. education is a synonym for academic learning. I wouldn't say that's the purpose of education, or indeed what education is. Education is about how you learn to fulfil your potential in a pluralist world, how you relate. It's all of those things. Otherwise, why would you have some of the subjects taught at school? So I think there's a limit to say simply that sharing is about education, because then it is around priorities and is around looking at how you do systems. But if this is about societal benefit, which is where I see the key purpose, lifelong learning, it's at the core of what we do here. It doesn't what happened between the ages of 4 and 18. So of course there should be societal benefits. And sharing for me is both the academic, if you like, in that sense, the intellectual. But as important, it's about how we learn to live together.
I think if you look at the response from the CRC, I think page 2-3 of the response, it highlights some research which shows that sharing and learning together actually increases academic achievement of those people who undertake schooling in that sort of a way. And that's partly what I mean by I don't know any parent who doesn't want the best for their child. Well, academically they will get the best for their child when their child learns and develops together with other communities from different backgrounds. I think the learning and developing together, as we highlighted in the response, or separate schooling, I should say, contributes to an own group bias, and that does have a societal implication. Learning and developing together actually, I think, does huge benefit for this, have huge benefit for this society, but it actually has benefit for the individuals who do it in terms of their academic achievement.
Okay, thank you.
I think a huge amount of money has been invested into sharing and education, not least of all within the shared campuses. So the purpose is sharing, but with a purpose as well as education. It's shared in relation to the TPOC commitments, but also in the delivering social change. Atlantic Philanthropies are investing a substantial amount of money in shared education, as with the Piece 4 has a huge chunk proposed for shared education. So, I mean, there's a responsibility then to ensure that money isn't wasted, it's targeted, it's built upon and supported.
Yeah, well, certainly the big buzz at the moment is towards shared education. It does worry some of us slightly that the emphasis may be too great, and that's why I keep hammering on about these things, because I wonder where it would be now if the same emphasis had been put on integrated education over the last 40 years, frankly. I mean, What difference do you think that the words facilitate and encourage have made to the integrated sector over the last 40 years? And that is going to be cancelled out, in fact, by the fact that the is going to have the same emphasis.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogers?
Thank you.
You don't have to answer that.
You're very welcome. And just carrying on there from Trevor, I was a bit alarmed, Peter, when you said that some of these projects reinforce segregation. Have you, for example, spoken to the two communities in Moy?
Well, when I made that comment, it wasn't dealing with any specific example. So I don't know the detail of the Moy project, although I've heard about it in the news. The answer is no, I haven't directly talked to the various communities in the Moy.
I think it'd certainly be worthwhile. But just going back to an earlier point there about the societal benefits and so on, Queen's Centre for Shared Education believe that there has been greater penetration when the outcomes have been education outcomes rather than societal outcomes. Where do you stand on that?
You see, with interest declared, I served on the advisory panel for shared education in Queen's because I'm a Queen's senator and saw this early stuff and then 15 years with integrated schools. So it's hard for me to set aside that and talk in my current role, which has a much more restricted brief. But in terms of, I have a problem when people talk about hard outcomes and soft outcomes. And I would challenge anybody who's teaching, let's say, STEM subjects and the hard outcome is your A-levels, and somebody who's teaching a soft subject about the other, about race or homophobia, and saying that that is easier to teach and that the outcome is easier to attain. And I would love to lose those two things. So the idea that educational outcomes are only measured in terms of A-levels and GCSEs and Key Stage 1s and 2s needs to be lost, because it says we measure numbers. And we actually, is it valuing what you measure or measuring what you value? And I think we do much of the former. And I think we should start valuing what we, measuring what we value. Now, if we really value educational outcomes, absolutely measure them. But do we measure and do we value how societal difference is impacted by young people who learn to live with difference, to learn to not just tolerate, but to actually deal with difference and see that I can still say who I am and you can be who you are. I hear your narrative. I grow up with you. I long to live alongside you, but can disagree with you and still remain friends or colleagues. Now, we're saying here, sharing that is real, that is deep, that is penetrative, that is intentional, can actually deliver both the educational outcome, but can also reduce the impact of some of the prejudicial attitudes that we see. Because we see homophobia, we see racism, we see all sorts of attitudes, even sexism still within schools. Kids are saying 1 in 5 almost they've seen a racial attack within a school or heard racial comments in the school. Despite all the bullying policies, homophobic bullying is still high. And yet we know there are good policies out there. So I think what we're saying is, of course, educational outcomes are important, but they shouldn't determine someone's future or only be the only measure of their life. And we're saying, if we're really serious about sharing, it's not simply to get your 24, 27 GCSE and A-levels. This is about how we can learn to live together in this place we call home.
And just when you mentioned that there earlier too, when you talked about difference, it doesn't mean that difference disappears.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. And I have some concerns personally about celebrating difference, because not all differences do I want to celebrate, actually. And we're being told almost I have to welcome what you do. Now, a very simple one is FGM. No one here would say we should celebrate that difference. Now, I'm being pejorative here because we need to be really careful. This is not social engineering, bringing somebody up to say we're all the same. This is actually bringing up a society where we can understand difference and realise it's not a threat, but it's actually something that enriches. Now, proper sharing can actually do that. So we have well-formed young people. You go to some of these shared schools and you'll see it. These are not young people who are clones. They're also young people who live and accept multiple identities. They don't have a barcode born at life and says, that's who I am, because identity is not just fixed either, because I often said at one time I wasn't a father or a parent or a brother. I'm all those things now. Your identity moves through life. And schools where sharing takes place, young people then realise that my identity isn't the only thing that forms me, and in fact, I may have more than one of them. And I think what we're saying is when that's facilitated well, it only augurs best for the future.
So you would say there's a place for religious imagery or even political imagery
Well, it's already within the curriculum, and I think my colleague Darren has said it really well. If you think of an axis here, a single identity school in a single identity neighbourhood can enhance that part of an axis by having a shared curriculum. Its governance could be shared. It can bring in teachers from the other tradition. It could have outside groups coming in extracurricular. It develops that axis. But if it moves out across here, where it has sharing with other schools, it moves up here, where that is impacting what we would say, I suppose, good shared education. We shouldn't diminish the fact that people can start from where they are, and in fact we should encourage and incentivise that. But it should be real sharing, I think, and somehow we shouldn't simply say, well, you can't do it, so you're not on the game, if you like. But Trevor's idea that we are somehow being shepherded into this shared education future against our will shouldn't be something that people fear. But if we're saying it's a shared society, surely one element of that is how we can maximise sharing within the educational system. And we shouldn't be afraid to say that.
And the critical aspect of that is, are the children and young people learning and developing together? It's about the kids, it's about the people, it's not about the buildings, it's not about the structure, it's not about the system.
And just taking that on, do you believe there's a place for religious instruction in schools? Do you believe there's a place for religious instruction in schools?
I have my own views on that, and I'm 3 years in the Commission, and in my 3 years I haven't heard that discussed or debated, so I have to defer to Darren. I don't think we've formed a view on that.
I'm not aware of the view.
No, so let me go back and see if there has been one. I would be very surprised if the Commission had any view that would say it shouldn't be there. I mean, it was formed by the main churches. People have asked questions around whether other faiths should be represented in the primary school curriculum. It's not for us to say. But, and also there is an opt-out, as you know. Children don't have to take part. Some schools don't necessarily tell parents that. But I think RE now that's being run, it seems to me, is a great opportunity to maximise sharing.
Yeah, I'm not sure the CRC would have a formal view on that either, but it just seems to me natural that if you want to understand other communities, then you need to have a degree of understanding of the religious side of things, and therefore that should be part of the curriculum. I think the debate is how it is and where it is.
And we obviously also mentioned in an answer at the start of the session, you know, in terms of parental choice, the ability to attend faith-based schools, so clearly that would allow. On the point about sort of the Queen's research and the educational advantages and that, clearly, obviously the Commission is very keen to see educational advantages. We want to see every child maximising their potential, irrespective of their background. But the sort of lessons in terms of the social, advancing the social side of things that came out of the Queen's research and the shared education was really the importance of sustained and meaningful contact, that it had to be more than sort of isolated incidences or isolated projects. It had to be the opportunity to build relationships there between the pupils and to build that idea of mutual understanding. So that was key to advancing the social side of things as well.
I think it's interesting, there were longitudinal research done a few years back that says that if for example, Darren's Catholic, I'm Protestant, I am become a friend with him through a shared project, that his friendship circle has a reduced antagonism towards the outgroup, that is me, through his friendship with me. So there's a domino impact. I mean, we have all this research that actually says shared education actually works, but it shouldn't diminish the fact that it should be good shared education. In other words, that the educational outcomes are there, as Darren says. So we should be addressing the issues of underachievement. And it's not as if one should be played off against the other.
Thank you, that was helpful.
Thank you. Mr Newton.
Thank you, Chair, and I welcome the members here today. I'd like, Chair, if you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to mention what I think are a couple of important things that have come out of the discussion this morning. I am, I have to say, surprised that indeed you haven't made any effort to try and understand the Moy situation. I think that is, to produce your paper on this and yet not to have looked at what is, I think, going to be a very significant development led by the principals, with the parents, for the pupils and for the entire Moy community. And I think it's a huge weakness that you haven't actually looked at that at this stage. And I say that as someone who, like others at this table, I'm a believer in integrated education. And my wife and I tried to encourage our children to embrace integrated education via the Methody model of integration, which I believe is a paragon that should be, and I would hope shared education, when we eventually arrive at it, will be something similar to the Methody. And I'm accepting that we don't have a definition of shared education at this moment in time. But I do believe that there'll be many features of that. But I know that when people see it, they will embrace it. I believe that that's the way things are going. Not having looked at the Moy situation, I find what has been said this morning, and indeed the response, I find some difficulty with the ethos of the response, Michael. I have to say that. And I would have some concerns about placing a duty on principals and teachers that they have to be a statutory duty on this issue. I find some difficulty with that. And taking one of the things that you'd said earlier, and in response to the chair, when she raised the point about a hierarchy of sectors, that, and I hope I'm saying this right, Michael, you indicated you don't have an opinion on a hierarchy of sectors. Yet surely the Equality Commission should have an opinion where one sector is disadvantaged against another sector in the educational process. And around what you've said gives me some concern, but in terms of specifically about the issue of shared education, it's certainly not coming through to me that this is something that either CRC or the Equality Commission are embracing with any enthusiasm. And is it not true that shared education is just a logical step along the way towards integrated education? Perhaps finally, but a step towards integrated education. But it is totally focused. It's not forced. And it's just a natural educational process at which parents, schools, bodies will embrace for the betterment of, and I know this, whether it's a societal thing or an educational thing, I believe society and the educational process will work out, will advantage from it.
Well, let me just respond to a couple. The simplest one first. We haven't asked for a statutory duty to be put on schools. In fact, the opposite. We've actually been arguing that the Section 75 duties shouldn't be put on schools, and that's our current position. Schools that already sit under bodies that have a Section 75 duty, and therefore anything that a school does is, if you like, there is a subvention under that, but also the various laws of anti-discrimination apply to young people and teachers in schools, with the exception of the Fair Employment Treatment Order, and also transgender children are actually not covered within a school under equality legislation. And there's an exemption on the curriculum to do with sexual orientation as a result of the discussions on the sexual orientation. So, Robin, I'm not sure where you read that,
well,
but
if I've picked it up wrong,
that's the easiest one for us to say. We don't believe at the minute that there would be enough evidence for us to say we should put that duty on the 1,200 schools. Now, the Minister's minded to look at that. We're quite happy to respond to that if and when it comes, but our current position is there's enough protections without it. The second thing is, in terms of the Moy, this may be down to us trying to explain to people the role of the Equality Commission, and it's what I tried to say at the top. The Equality Commission is a creature of statute that has certain responsibilities placed on it. And one of those responsibilities is not actually to look at what's happening in shared education or shared villages or shared housing. Our role is to look at government policy or the policy of public bodies and the implementation of their statutory duties and whether they comply. Now, in this particular case, if there was something by doing this that one of the statutory bodies, the controlled or maintained sector, were in dereliction of their duty, and we felt that to be the case, or it was reported to us to be the case, we could then have a view on it. So it's probably a misunderstanding of our role, Robin, and that's not trying to dodge anything. So we wouldn't have a view on the Moy, but I'm very happy to bring back your concerns to the Commission before we take our view on the bill. So I'll undertake to do that. The third thing is the hierarchy. Again, this would be about the Equality Commission taking a view on current legislation and the carrying out of policy, and whether or not, therefore, the current 1989 Education Reform Order breaches any equality duties. It doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, and there's never been any case raised. So there's never been an issue where the Equality Commission has said that that gives a higher level to the integrated, or indeed the Irish language sector, than other sectors, which actually have the Education Library Boards and CCMS to promote them. And then finally, embracing it. When you're writing responses, it's hard sometimes to put passion into them. I would have to say there was unanimity in our board when we were signing this off, and we welcomed it. I think we've said that. But not having the full response into the paper yet, to the bill, we haven't sort of talked about what sharing should be defined as. But let me make it clear. Absolutely, this is a very good step. If it is systemic, if it is sustained, if it has outcomes, if it's all the parameters of which we've said, absolutely we embrace this. And in terms of, is this the road to a formally integrated school, there are those who believe that to be the case. Our view at the minute is that there are parents who will want formally integrated schools, and they should be continued to be supported. And there are parents who will want a shared educational system, which may or may not end up in a formally integrated school. That should also be supported. So I'm sorry if that maybe didn't come through in the response.
And yeah, just to be clear, the Commission has, in a number of responses, been very clear that we feel that sharing should be central to the system, that it should be meaningful, and that it should impact on every pupil. I mean, just to clarify the point at the very top, we have said that we feel shared education is likely to benefit from a statutory obligation on the department, but we haven't. We last looked at the issue 7 years ago, I think. We haven't said that we thought that schools would benefit from a statutory obligation on them, and indeed there seems to be various models being proposed in the sector, whether that's a variant of Section 75, either enhanced or light, whether it's a policy directive from DE down, or whether it's mainstreaming through the curriculum and things like that. There are different models, and if the department are going to look at that, we look forward to seeing that.
But the issue is how you ensure a school actually fulfils a department duty, which the department, let's say, policy aim for sharing, and that's what we talked about. You've got to value what you measure.
And just very briefly, Chair, if I can, just in a couple of those responses as well, I would agree with the tenor of what's said there. I think the CRC probably are in the same place with it. For us, the critical issue is about learning and developing together for children and young people. If shared education helps to bring that about, then it is something that we would warmly welcome. But you'll be aware, Robin, that there are many different views around all of these issues, and it's something that we, as an organisation, will want to embrace and understand all of those views. But essentially, at the core of it is, if it does lead to, and hopefully it will lead to, children and young people learning and developing together, I think it's a potentially very positive move. I think it is about the continuum and what happens next over the next number of years. In terms of the Moy, personally, I haven't been down to the Moy. Very happy to do that. I'm not sure if the organisation has in formulating its response. That's something I'll find out, but it's certainly something that maybe we should be learning from more actively.
Could you just say, I think shared education will have many features to that brand, but the important thing is that those who have the best interests of the children, parents, principals, can all buy into it.
Okay, thank you. Mr McCausland.
Apologies. Thank you indeed for your presentations and the papers that we were given. If I could start with a couple of questions then regarding the Community Relations Council. First of all, I see a statement. I welcome the fact that in your on page 7 there you say that ethos and identity issues should be dealt with using the UNCRC framework. We've heard quite a number of references this morning to religious diversity. But we did also hear the term multicultural, and Michael reminded us that identity is multi-layered or multifaceted. So I welcome the fact that there's the endorsement there of the importance of the UNCRC, and in particular there, I think on page 9, you draw our attention to Article 29(1)(c), that state parties agree that the education of the child shall be directed to the development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language and values, as well as for the national values of the country in which the child is living. So there's a recognition there from CRC of the importance of the right of the child to be educated in relation to the culture of the home and the community from which they come. And that's good. I was also interested, you also referenced there on page 2 the Human Rights Commission report on education reform in Northern Ireland, where they say it's important to ensure that in the context of an increased move towards cross-community collaboration, that children's and young people's rights to their own cultural identity and freedom of religion are protected in shared arrangements. Now, that is something that I've taken up with other folk who've been making presentations, because before you even get to the shared arrangement, it's important that children come together on a basis of equality. And that point has been highlighted by a number of academics who have come in, and others who have written about it but who haven't been in to see us yet. So I welcome that. Do you feel, and has CRC carried out any investigation of or inquiry into, or are you aware of any research on how the cultural rights of children are being realised or implemented across the different sectors in Northern Ireland? Because we're bringing together different sectors here. And whilst clearly an Irish medium education sector will have a strong Irish cultural ethos with the Irish language, Irish games, Irish traditional music, etc., Gaelic games, and the same would largely true, although to a lesser degree, obviously in terms of language, in terms of the Catholic maintained sector. Particularly in terms of the controlled sector, have you any views on how that, or have you done any work on that regard?
In relation to training, do you mean?
Well, in terms of how well the rights of the children are being realised or implemented, in terms of the controlled sector, are there differences of approach to culture in the classroom between the Irish medium, the Catholic maintained and the controlled sector? We've heard views from others on this regard.
I suppose my other interest is in bringing the diversity together rather than exploring within the curriculum how the curriculum's being delivered. Is that what you're alluding to, Nelson?
No, I'm saying you've mentioned there that children have the right to learn about in the school. One of the purposes of the education should be directed towards the child learning about his or her own cultural identity, language and values, because what is taught in a school is affirmed by the system, therefore to be of value, to be worthwhile, to be something to be affirmed and so on. It's seen positively, whereas if something is kept out of the school, it is seen more largely in a negative way. So quite clearly there is a strong cultural ethos in certain sectors, but within the controlled sector, any thoughts on how that is working out in that sector?
I think key to that is around teacher training and around sharing and understanding and diversity. We have been engaged with our groups on the ground, and they've been engaged by supporting them to engage with the schools and to explore cultural identity and explore other identities. And of course there's the whole commemorations aspect to the work, understanding where people, if they take for example within a historical context, how they might view history and reflect on it. We've done a lot of work around that as well, engaging with the schools.
I'm encouraged that you've mentioned this in the presentation.
Yes.
I have to say that I'm disappointed insofar as I think across, and I'll come to the Equality Commission in a moment, but across the presentations, there hasn't been as yet an acknowledgement of the different approaches to culture and cultural traditions across the different sectors. If you're bringing together children from different sectors, from different cultural backgrounds, and they come together where one is coming, a group of children are coming from a background where their cultural identity is affirmed, validated, esteemed within, embraced within the school, and others come from a community where their cultural activities and so on are kept locked outside the school, or maybe in some cases, or given very limited access, but are not mainstreamed in the curriculum. Then I think you're bringing together children on an unequal basis, and that's, you're back to the I've used the illustration before, Pierre Trudeau, about Canada being in bed with the elephant with Canada and America. How do you work on that issue of bringing children together where they're both coming with that same cultural confidence to engage and embrace with each other?
Are you suggesting that a section of the community is being disadvantaged within school in relation to access to their culture?
Yeah, it's an issue that's been around for quite a number of years. I can remember going back to CCEA way back in the mid-90s about this issue. And there was an acknowledgement there, in fact, by a very senior person in CCA at that time, who's moved on to even better things since then, who made the point that because, for example, a Catholic church or school is part of the parish, and the parish will have its GA club and all its cultural identity, it's very rooted and grounded. And he said there was a difference between that and the controlled sector and how they deal with culture. So that if CCA wanted to organise an event, they could go to almost any large number of Catholic maintained schools to get, say, an Irish traditional music group or something to perform. He said when we go to a controlled school, he said he mentioned a school somewhere up near Castlederg, I think it was, that had a pipe band in the school, but very limited choice. And it was just a reflection or a small illustration of a fundamental difference there. Is that something that CRC has looked at?
It's something that has been raised with us as an issue that we would want, that anyone has said they want to explore further. Nelson, our interest is bringing together the diverse backgrounds of the young people to share and explore together. In relation to the sector...
So CRC has no interest in...
We have. Oh, certainly, you've raised it, and if it's an issue, I'm happy to speak to you about it. It hasn't been raised with us as a specific issue that within the school, children are being disadvantaged by accessing their identity or traditions.
Well, for example, the Ulster Scots Agency at the moment has to directly, out of their core budget, fund programmes to put into schools certain cultural activities. So they facilitate the school in regards to maybe additional teaching in Scottish country dancing or something, whatever the activity is.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not necessarily automatically embraced.
I see.
Chair,
I was just going to conclude just the type of programmes we've been engaged in with the schools in relation to bring together to look at cultural and identity. Carmela are engaged in a Facing History and Ourselves, with their exploration with young people together, and they're coming from different backgrounds, and that's perhaps to tease out some of their...
It's the point of coming on the basis of equality, where the children have got an equal background, strength, affirmation within the school. And I mean, the other point there, just... it was a comment that I picked up there not so long ago from an American academic who was using this in a different context, but she was talking about if girls go into a school situation, well, sorry, I quote this in there, Professor there just from Chicago University pointing out, education always reflects a society's views of what is excellent, worthy and necessary. So if the curriculum school system doesn't embrace the culture, it is not affirming it and saying this is excellent, worthy and necessary. But that school, they do such and such, they do A, B and C as culture, and that is excellent, worthy and necessary because it's in the classroom. Yours isn't because yours kept outside the school.
Chair, if I could add 2 or 3 things to it. And I think, first of all, what the CRC does actively on a daily basis actually is acknowledge cultural expression across this community in all sorts of different ways, and supports a huge amount of work within the Protestant Unionist community as well as the Catholic Nationalist Republican side of the community, as well as the BME sector and many other sectors. I suppose the CRC in its funding role, for example, wouldn't get into the youth side of things and the school side of things, but nevertheless the principle of approaching things on a basis of equality and making sure that where there is cultural expression and good cultural expression is something that we want to support, and is actually part of the future for this society, because we need to value all sorts of cultural expression from all sides of the community. I think the issue, obviously, from the, if I'm taking you up right, Nelson, from the school's perspective, isn't about disadvantaging one side of the community. In other words, if you're saying that on the Catholic maintained side there is a very positive expression of culture, that's fine. What you're saying is that reflected on the other side of the community divide within the schooling system there?
It's right, should be right for all sectors.
Sure, and I think the principle of that is not something that we would disagree with. I think that's absolutely right. It may be that the conversations that are needed within the Protestant Unionist side of the community divide in terms of culture and how that is reflected in schools is something that we would want to engage in, actually, because if that's not being done adequately or isn't being something that properly reflects that side of the community in terms of its learning about its own culture and identity, then I think that's something that we need to engage with, because we would certainly have a view on that, which is that cultural expression does need to be part of the learning, and therefore that is something that the school sector needs to reflect on, as do the organisations outside the school sector as well.
I've certainly passed that on. I'm sure that folks will take up that offer. Could I just turn to Equality Commission role? I read through the document, and there was no mention of the issue of equality in terms of accessing the cultural rights of the child. Now, maybe that's something where there's a crossover between yourselves and the Human Rights Commission, and maybe they're meant to look after whether human rights are implemented equally and there's no discrimination, or is there a crossover?
Okay, well, in terms of our response, it was around the nature of sharing and shared education, and it was how that is maximised, and we've talked about the deep sharing and so on. I don't think we've touched on Catholic culture, let's call it that for shorthand, versus Protestant culture in this sense. But if you're asking me in broad terms, first of all, I'm old enough to remember single identity work when Brian Mawhinney introduced it, and then the idea was you prepare your own community to understand itself for engagement with the other, and then you went into some cross-community contact, and eventually you went into sharing, and there was this sort of virtuous circle almost, that that's how you did it. And we now know that there are lots of different ways to do it, but one thing that research is saying that people do need to be reasonably aware of who they are and what they are before they engage with the other, absolutely. So what we said at the top of this is we weren't pointing out all the areas of research. We're simply saying within our gift, we'll talk about what we feel is important. There is a huge amount of work out there, and it seems to me that the most important thing in this is this flimsy word, ethos. And that's where my own research has been. And the closest I've found to ethos definition is it's the way we do things around here. Now, when you're in a school or a joint school and talking about shared schools, the person who actually develops the ethos, because ethos research seems to say isn't fixed, the head teacher controls it. And when head teachers come and go, ethos in schools can change. So those in charge of a school have a trickle-down effect on the ethos, and the research is clear in this. How do kids then engage with culture in the school? Well, it's within the curriculum and it's within the extracurricular activities. But more important, it's in what we would call in research the hidden curriculum. It's what people say and do. It's how we do stuff around here. Now, you can't write that down, but there's a huge amount of research around how people feel they're being made generous gestures towards. I think teachers need learning in this. They'll tell us this constantly. I don't know how Catholics, Protestants think. You know, Protestant teachers will often say the Catholic culture is very visible. In the integrated system, when a school was transforming, it was seen as a lot of Catholic imagery coming in, and there's a Protestant deficit almost created. Now, the research is then saying when schools address that and say, well, what is it that defines Protestantism? There's a huge amount of curricular material around, and it's everything from engaging with, the war, to going to graveyards, to bringing people in from the outside. And I think, for me, it's out there. It's extremely important. Now, whether it's directly an equality matter, I don't see that it falls under our gamut, but that's not that we're avoiding it. I do think it would be wrong if there was some imbalance between sharing, that this was seen to be all one side. And I think, therefore, what we're saying is the training and resources needs to be there. That's where youth work and the non-NGOs from the outside can give huge amount of help in this one, where young people then can actually be allowed to experiment and understand what it is. As a 4-year-old, do I really know my culture? As a 16-year-old, I'm beginning to develop that. So, absolutely, Nelson, it's an important thing.
Well, in deference to the Chair, I'll stop there. In respect to the Chair, I'll stop there. But I do think it is quite often the elephant in the room, and the fact that it didn't appear significantly or hasn't been looked into yet does cause concern, but we will follow it up and
Yeah.
act on those.
And likewise, if I undertake, I'll
Yes.
be back in touch with Nelson and make sure that that goes back to our commission as well.
And I think from our perspective, we would want to understand the point better, maybe, that is being made. And if we can engage in any positive way, then that's what we will do.
Thank you. Mrs Overend, for a
Thank you,
final
Chair.
question.
And I've cut it right down, or I've cut my questions right down to one. But my apologies also for not being here at the beginning, but I'll be sure to read Hansard for all the information. I just really wanted to ask you, had you had a chance or maybe proposed to examine the independent review of the home to school transport review? I'm sure that you'll find that interesting. And what's your view on achieving more integration if children are forced to go to their nearest schools? I mean, it could mean that, you know, we'll have more single identity schools and rather than less, if that's
A very simple answer. I mean, it will be something that we will be looking at and doing a response to, because there are issues there about equality of access and equality of opportunity, inevitably. I mean, at the minute, you can choose to go beyond 2 or 3 miles and pay for the transport, unless there isn't a school of your type within it. And we know this, and we know there are restrictions. But does that have the law of unintended consequence somewhere down the line? And I think those are the things we need to look at.
I think we'd probably mirror that answer as well. I'm afraid it probably will be part of the response. The response will come in a few years.
I suppose we're also interested in relation to sharing across schools and the issue of transport, and that has to be accommodated if we're genuine about enabling that to happen.
Could we also say there were some issues in the learning partnerships when they were set up? You know, young people who moved for a day to school B were showing the bus pass and the driver said that you're not coming from that school. Or things ran to 4 o'clock in the evening and the bus driver says it's only valid until. So there's also an issue about should schools have the budget in their own hands. You know, there's other ways of looking at this, I think, that needs to be examined. But certainly what we will look at is there any equality impact in terms of the public sector duties that fall on the, you know, the boards and who provide the transport? Would it have that law of unintended, or indeed it may have a very direct consequence, particularly if you think of rurality and some of the urban areas?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a very long session. Can I thank you for your contributions this morning, and I would be quite confident that we'll be meeting again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Members, we're about 3/4 of an hour over, so just to bear that in mind, and I still want very much your engagement in the next session, so I would be asking you perhaps not to leave, just to give respect to our next set of witnesses. If you could indicate early as well, and it gives us an indication just of how many members then want to speak. I would appreciate that. So our next session is from the Integrated Education Fund and also from Professors Hamber and Smith. Just refer you to the cover note at page 131 and the submissions from IEF, Professor Hamber and Professor Smith. We welcome the following witnesses to the meeting. We have Tina Merrin, who's the Chief Executive of the Integrated Education Fund, Sam Fitzsimons, the Communications Director of IEF, Professor Brandon Hamber, the University of Ulster, and also Professor Alan Smith from the University of Ulster. Can I first of all apologise for the delay? You were here for at least part of the session, so you understand the engagement that there is with members, and I didn't want to curtail that conversation too much, but I do want to extend my apologies to you. If you'd like to make your opening statements, I assume that you've spoken amongst yourselves as to how you wish to organise that part of the session, and we will then follow up with questions.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for inviting us here today. Just to say that I think the Integrated Education Fund will go first, myself, and then Sam, and then Professor Brandon Hamilton, and then finally Alan Smith, Professor Alan Smith. Okay. The IEF's presentation is actually very brief, which might help with the timing of this. So let me introduce myself first. I'm Tina Merrin, the Chief Executive of the Integrated Education Fund. And like I said, I'd like to thank you for inviting us here today. I just want to give you a brief background on the fund and outline some of our plans and some of our points in the submission, and it will be brief. The Integrated Education Fund is an independent charitable trust which is dependent entirely on fundraising. The trust is needed because the Government does not adequately plan for the development of integrated education in Northern Ireland. The dual purpose of the fund is to increase places across Northern Ireland to meet parental demand and to support meaningful reform of our education system into a single system. Without educational reform, the vast majority of our children will continue to be educated separately according to the religious or community background. The cost of inaction will mean another generation growing up with limited contact with one another. Northern Ireland has reached a point where most people agree that educating our children together is the way forward. This is evidenced by regular independent surveys and polling, as well as community support. The task ahead is to encourage and challenge everyone to imagine what it could be like if our children were educated together, rather than apart, and bring about the changes needed to make this a reality. We recognise that reforming a well-established education system won't happen overnight, but we have already come a long way and some major steps have been taken. Further change is needed in planning, and the Integrated Education Fund wants communities to put at the heart of that educational planning. Any future decisions for our education system must include the views of the community. Education planning that does not take account of parental demand or aspiration into consideration is neither sufficient nor acceptable. It cannot be left solely to the existing education providers or sectors to determine the future of schools in any area. The Department of Education must seek a method to find out what parents want in terms of the types of schools in their local area. To do this, they need a process of engaging and involving communities in area-based planning process. The IEF would ask the Education Committee to be supportive in helping find an independent mechanism to assess parental demand. We should not assume that the types of schools that we have is what parents want. Putting communities at the heart of education should threaten no one. And I'll pass you over to Sam.
Again, I'd like to thank the Chair for inviting us to give evidence today. And equally, my presentation will be quite brief as well, but I'll expand a little bit on what Tina said. In 2014, the Fund published an alternative manifesto for education, in which we advocate a move away from the current divisive nature of our education system. Education is central and vital to creating an inclusive society. This can only be achieved by establishing a unified, coherent education system. The IEF Alternative Manifesto sets out our shared vision for an inclusive and equal Northern Ireland society, free from social and cultural barriers. It is a roadmap indicating opportunities to deliver sustainable change and alternative approaches to 6 key areas of Northern Ireland's education system. The first is area-based planning, which is shaped by the community and which reflects parental choice, community needs, desire for shared future and fiscal realities. Second is a single authority for the administration of education. The third, a single teacher training system. Fourth is a single model of governance for all schools. Fifth is the extension of fair employment legislation to the recruitment of teachers. And sixth is the application of Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act to all schools. The Integrated Education Fund, we challenge the Committee to recommend that a comprehensive independent review of the economic impact of both shared and integrated education is carried out, with the principal aim of better informing policy decisions. We would also encourage the Committee to recommend establishing an accessible evidence base on shared and integrated education that would be used to underpin policy decisions on strategic investment and reform of our education system. I'd like to thank the committee once again for taking the time to hear us.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here to address the committee today. I do appreciate the invitation. I'm here in my capacity as a practitioner and a researcher who's been working on peace building and reconciliation issues in a range of societies over nearly 2 decades. I'm also the director of the International Conflict Research Institute at Ulster University. Given the limited time, I'll be very brief in my opening comments. I'll speak for about 3 to 4 minutes and focus on the challenges facing education here from an international perspective. Incidentally, that's not something you can do in 3 or 4 minutes, but I'll give it my best shot. Before I do this, I would like to acknowledge the substantial progress towards peace that has been made. All involved should be commended, and this is recognised internationally. That said, Northern Ireland remains a society that is deeply divided and is emerging from conflict. As you all know, around the table, 90% of children are educated in schools which are predominantly Protestant or predominantly Catholic. DE figures show that almost half of Northern Ireland school children are still being taught in schools where 95% or more pupils are of the same religion. When I share this fact with politicians, practitioners and peace builders around the world, they're astounded, as integrated education is internationally considered a fundamental building block of sustainable peace. This is not to say that schools dominated by one tradition and another are inherently bad, and many serve their children very well with very sound academic education. However, I do think it is questionable whether they're able to fully supply the core skills which children need in today's society. The consultation document on a shared education policy launched in January 2015 in fact raises this very issue, asserting society is changing rapidly and we must respond to that change to best meet the needs of our children and young people. In addition, there is growing international research that shows that diversity increases productivity on a number of levels. In Northern Ireland, researchers also convincingly confirmed that separate schooling on grounds of religion can create negative social attitudes of those perceived as the other. I can share all that research with you. I'm not going to quote it all. The United States Institutes of Peace, one of the largest state-funded peace-building organizations in the world, funded by the United States government, concludes that integration of schools is an important structural aspect of education. And when ethnic groups are educated separately within the national education system, important overt or hidden messages to students are inevitably conveyed about other groups in society. That's from a report in 2006. It's interesting to note that several high-level documents and policies specifically recognise local policies, recognise the importance of integrated education too. The 1998 agreement, as all of you know around the table, sees integrated education, and I quote, an essential aspect of the reconciliation process and key to promoting a culture of tolerance. The consultative group on the past says reconciliation may never be achieved if our children continue to attend separate schools. The consultation document on a shared education policy notes the education system mirrors historical division here, and the benefits of educating children and young people together are increasingly recognised. As Tina mentioned, social surveys also show the vast majority of the general public routinely see integrated education as key to the future. And in fact, the consultative document I quoted before notes public and political attitudes have evolved to the degree where moving to a more inclusive education system is now a distinct possibility. Yet the provision, and therefore the choice, is simply not available to many parents. Indeed, there is an inequality in provision. Comprehensive research on the subject has concluded that the main reason for preferences for integrated education not being met is insufficient numbers of shared spaces to accommodate demand. Other divided societies continue to learn from the work of the integrated education movement in Northern Ireland, yet within Northern Ireland there appears to be little political will to support this groundbreaking and internationally recognised movement. Instead, the learning from what has been achieved by the integrated education movement seems to have shifted into the direction of shared education. At face value, sharing and contact between groups is of course positive. The research in this area is promising, showing, among other benefits, the type of intergroup contact shared education offers can lead to more positive relationships and perception of others, and also build into school collaboration. In many senses, however, the move to shared education merely proves the obvious. International research, social psychological research, has shown for decades now that under certain conditions, contact between groups can promote positive views of others. Of course, any increased contact between school-aged children of different traditions is to be welcomed, but as recent research on shared education notes, an environment that seemingly reinforces a monoculture order can limit the potential of such programs. In other words, contact programs taking place within an overall segregated social context, despite their positive indicators, are not necessarily conducive to creating positive attitudes between groups over the long term. It is, from a policy perspective, counterintuitive to set up a new large-scale community relations program to bring children into meaningful contact in schools with one another through various collaborative ventures at great expense financially and in terms of resources, when the context itself is going to continually undermine any potential achievements, unless this is part of a wider strategy to fundamentally change the context. Of course, there are many reasons why the context cannot be changed instantly, and we must foster contact where we can. But to lose sight of the fact that logically and economically the most viable place to foster contact is in an integrated classroom on a day-to-day basis is missing the most obvious long-term sustainable solution. Shared education should not become a policy end in itself. I therefore urge the committee to be bold in its recommendations and set a staged long-term timetable for integration. This will truly offer the children the best opportunity, the future locally and globally, and give Northern Ireland its rightful place as an exemplary peace process. Thank you.
Good morning. Yeah, I'm also grateful of the opportunity to meet with the committee. I did provide a written submission. My name is Alan Smith. I hold the UNESCO chair at the University of Ulster. Most of my professional career has worked in this area from the early 1980s, both as a teacher and then as a development worker in promoting what has now come to be known as shared education, I think, in communities such as Strabane and Enniskillen and Limavady. Interestingly, the same sort of areas that seem to be promoted and still engaged in shared education today. My interest here is as trying to give some kind of independent critique, really, on what I see as where shared education is being introduced into legislation, its aspirations in terms of policy, but maybe trying to ground that a little bit by looking at the realities of what is represented in the actual operational plans proposed by the Department of Education for this. Because I think the inconsistencies there often are the things that should be of most concern for us. So there is a more detailed submission which has highlighted some significant limitations, I think, in the Department's operational plan for this, this policy, particularly in terms of impact, numbers of pupils that are currently affected. I mean, I think my academic colleagues at Queen's are estimating about 10,000 pupils currently involved, which is actually less than involved in integrated schooling at the minute. In terms of additional financial costs on what is already an expensive separate school system, but particularly around sustainability after the philanthropic input over the initial 4-year period is no longer there, and how those costs are likely to be absorbable by schools, given other competing priorities. Added logistical and bureaucratic burden, I think, if this is actually scaled up to the level which is proposed in the Department's operational plan, I think is hugely ambitious. Evidence from other international contexts, which you're familiar with from other inputs, that shared campuses may seem like a well-intentioned, perhaps stepping stone in some people's eyes towards greater integration within the education system, but evidence from other contexts suggesting that it might actually increase animosity. So I'm willing to respond on the detail behind any of those. I think I would just like to conclude with 3 comments as well about how things have moved on since making that written submission, and now the Minister's statement and the Shared Education Bill, which is in some sense overtaking, I guess, your deliberations on this. We're now in the situation where the Act commits to a promotion of shared education as yet not defined. I'm not quite sure if that legislative process is very common in many jurisdictions to actually create legislation to commit to something which hasn't been defined, but that's the situation we're in. So there would be concerns, I think, around the definition of shared education. It's not clear what problem it is actually designed to address. Is it about creating better community relations? I mean, is this another iteration of a community relations programme? Or is it about trying to address intolerance amongst our children and young people? Is it about addressing socio-economic deprivation? Is it about economic inefficiencies? Is it to improve learning outcomes? It's not clear from the definition provided here. It's a very minimalist. It includes a reference, surprisingly, to children's political opinion, I'm not quite sure how primary schools are going to ascertain that in terms of their engagement, involvement in this programme. But I would imagine that most schools would look on that as a huge challenge. In operational terms, it's significant, I think, that integrated education statutory duty is on the department to encourage and facilitate integrated education, which, as some of the members have already indicated, has been quite a passive approach. It's been in the statute book for 25 years. We still have the same level of segregation within our education system. Significant also, this isn't about integrated schools. The statutory duty is about integrated education and the department's responsibility to do something about increasing integrated education, not simply consolidating an integrated school sector. However, the shared education power through the Education Authority rather than the department actually goes further than that statutory duty on integrated education. In the consultative documents it talked about encouraging facilitation. I see in the draft it's about actively promoting shared education, which I think will bring a tension between the statutory duty of the department to encourage and facilitate integration and the power, the statutory power of the Education Authority to not only encourage, facilitate, but to actively promote shared education. So you're already introducing some kind of differential here in the priority you're giving to these two policies, and I think that's going to lead to trouble further down the track. Lastly, well, I think another point is that there's a main limitation in most of the evidence that I've heard so far is that shared education seems to concentrate on attitudinal change between children. And nowhere in the department's plan are there targets or indicators which would suggest that this is any stepping stone towards anything other than more sharing between children and young people at a cost every year. For example, there's no targets for increasing the diversity of staffing within schools who are sharing, or indeed at the level of recognising diversity at the level of school governors. And finally, my biggest concern would be that this policy may actually deepen inequalities. That after the initial 4 years, that the department's own plan suggests that only 65% of schools will actually be eligible to receive funding from this, because the rest are too culturally isolated. And one of the criteria to access the funding is that you're already involved in some sharing. And of course, we know the most culturally isolated schools are also mapped very strongly onto the most socially disadvantaged. So we're going to have a programme for 4 years which gives those who are already sharing the opportunity for more sharing, and we're not going to allow access to those as possibly the most important target group, those children who are actually in schools where there isn't a diversity of learning environment already there in its place. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll be very brief because members have indicated. Obviously, if we were starting from a blank sheet, I think we would have a very different schooling system. But given where we are, in some ways we have to work with what we have. And I'm not entirely sure whether there is hostility to shared education or whether there is whether you have genuine concerns as to the route of travel. But I have read your submissions and I do find them very interesting, particularly Alan's comments in relation to where we're going with the investment of money. You have in your paper you have given us some alternative proposals for discussion. I would just be interested as to how you see voluntary amalgamations working across the traditional school sectors and whether you do see that as a viable option.
Well, I think the question hasn't been asked. Already the decision seems to have been made to put the financial investment in inviting schools to put forward proposals to share. No one has suggested there is an equivalent amount of funding available to school governors or parents in communities who would like to come together in processes to explore the possibility for rationalisation of the educational facilities in their area. So really all I'm saying, it's not a very it's not a very aspirational goal. I mean, you're already foreclosing of those who might be in communities who would be willing to engage in discussions about how there could be integration of schooling. You're already only making the funding available to those who want to share.
Yeah, I've been on this committee, with the exception of a short time, from 2007, and been through 3 different variations of ESA as it came then in the Education Authority, and became very, very aware of how entrenched people are within their systems and the challenges that there are to get over sectoral interests. So I'm guessing that perhaps, were you to go down this route, I think that it's something that should certainly be explored, but having that experience and just how difficult that it is to get people together to sort of cross that, I suppose that barrier of sectoral interest is a huge challenge.
But there's not the opportunity in the fund. You have £25 million fund, and it's only open for invitations for proposals to share. None of it is open to groups that would like to investigate the possibility of voluntary amalgamation.
I'm not sure that it has been closed down, but I think that might be something that the committee may want to explore with the department.
I've read the business plan, I've looked at the criteria. This is what.
Certainly, I think as a committee we'll explore that.
Yeah, it would be fantastic if it were to be broadened and included of that, because that would be responding to actually parental demand and community interest, and not simply through sectoral bodies.
Okay, I mean certainly there are challenges in all of this. All of you have in your submissions talked about Section 75 and that it should be applied to schools. Obviously, you heard the previous presentations, and neither organisation were promoting that. Could you maybe expand on that point?
Sorry, I didn't hear the beginning bit of the
in
other
relation to
presentation.
Section 75. Oh.
Sorry, we weren't there. We only came in the middle of it, so we didn't hear what they had said, what CRC or the Equality Commission said in Section 75.
Well, neither of them were promoting what you have been suggesting, in that it should be applied to schools. So it's really just where you've come from in order to have that that conclusion.
We think one of the things we're looking forward to is sort of common features across all schools. Should it be a common form of governance? Should it be a common form of administration? Should it be common form in terms of Section 75? Should it be the fair employment legislation? So it's standardised across all schools, so everybody's starting off on the same platform, and that's what we're trying to work towards, a single system.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on to Mr. Hazard, please?
Thanks very much, and thanks for the presentation. I suppose just a point of clarity now on the issue about the money in the shared. I was of the belief when the department were here, they clarified that all monies available were available for both shared and integrated projects. I may be wrong on that, but that's certainly what I took from that. But I look forward to getting clarity on that. It's really around what should take primacy here: parental choice, or the concept that integration is best, in theory, for going forward. Like if Tina, you said there about ascertaining what parents really think. If parents come back and say we want choice in the system, is the Integrated Education Fund or whatever, are you content with that, or do you still think that will be a segregated system and that we need to get rid of that system?
No,
so what should take primacy?
Integrated education is always about parental choice, right? It's what parents want, but we would surmise and say that a lot of parents are not actually asked. You have integrated schools in so many areas, but there's a lot of areas there isn't integrated schools. And when I say ask parents, I mean through an independent process, like a community audit, where you go out into the community, talk to the community over a period of time, have polls, ensure they get all the information from the different sectors, make sure they understand the difference, and then ask them what they would like. And the community as a whole, it's not about it's not about sectors deciding what everybody should have. It's what the parents want. I'm not aware of any full community engagement or audit the department has had across all the different sectors. And it should go into one area, especially in an area where there's going to be major change. You should ask the parents what they want in there, not what they've got, but what they'd like to see for the future.
Well, again, the opposing argument says somebody sitting in Belfast, a parent, has that choice available at every single level. There is the good choice there for every system, and yet the vast majority of parents still don't pick integrated. So it would suggest that they are being asked, but perhaps you don't like the answers that are coming back. And again, I'm playing devil's advocate here. I'm just wondering.
No, I would say, well, let's put it this way. Are they being asked? I mean, there's 2 integrated schools in the Belfast corridor. At the end of the day, have just got enrolment numbers increased because there's been the demand. So I would say they're not being asked. What you've got is what you've got at the minute. It's the current system, but nobody's actually asked them with an independent mechanism, not polls, not just polls, but going into an area and ask the parents what they want. And if the parents want what they've got, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, it's not about making all schools integrated schools, but actually asking the community. We have done a lot of community engagement work about 2 or 3 years ago, mostly in rural areas, and it's amazing how pragmatic parents are. They want a local school for their child, fairly close. They don't want to have to travel miles and miles, and they're quite happy for that school to be a community school, integrated school. They're less worried about the type of school as long as it's close to them.
Okay, so again, so that variety of choice is fine. If that's what's wanted, the variety of choice is fine. Again, I find it difficult then to match that with the language sometimes, like segregation, benign apartheid. If the integration movement themselves are saying, well, choice is fine if that's what parents want. But is it really fine if you're describing it as segregated?
It's not the Integrated Education Fund that describes it as segregated. OFM, DFM, Blue document says that what we have, the segregated nature of our education system. We also have the United Nations 2008 Rapporteur report, which said that we have segregated education, and that we should take steps to address that. So, Chris, perhaps maybe it's a higher authority.
Yeah. That's why I was saying about parental choice earlier. You know, maybe we keep falling back on parental choice when we shouldn't at times.
Well, I think sort of just to take up on what Tina said in relation to community audits. Michael Wardlow from the Quality Commission referred to a deliberative poll that took place in Omagh. I think it was 2007, 2008, where parents were informed about the options that of education provision that they could have, and they opted for either greater sharing or more integrated education. I think that's probably where we need to move to, as the department needs to move to, is that we need to inform parents of the options that they have, rather than allowing institutions to dictate the rationalisation within their area. And to date, there is a deficit in actually engagement with communities and parents.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the way I hear the recommendation is really a recommendation about truly understanding what this issue of choice is. I mean, from the comments you've made and others in listening in before, to me there seems to be a lot of different understandings of what choice is, and I actually think parents make quite complicated choices in the way that they choose a school. Sometimes it's purely pragmatic, sometimes it might be about culture and other backgrounds. We don't really know exactly that landscape of choice. It seems to me to suggest that there's an equal choice when there is only a 7% opportunity within a certain type of schooling is not an equal choice. It cannot, by definition, be an equal choice. In the same way as it cannot be an equal choice if one school is 10 miles from your house and one school is 1 mile from your house. That is not an equal choice. Now, that doesn't mean we need to be pie in the sky and say we can just simply change that. But I think we need to understand what we mean by choice in a much more detailed way. And there are all sorts of dimensions to choice. You know, if I think of my personal situation, if I want to take my son to an integrated school after he turns 11, that school is much further from the house from another type of a school. I happen to have a good job at the university, so I have that choice because I can get in my car and I can drive him there. But if I didn't have that job, I actually don't have that choice. So I would understand a more complicated sense of understanding of what do we really mean by choice, to also try and help square the circle if that's the right terminology, between the fact that we have all these high-level surveys that clearly show people are in favour of integrated and greater levels of sharing, but that's not really happening. So there's something there that needs to be explored. So I would understand a much more detailed analysis of all of that. On your point about I suppose the concept of segregated or the challenges with that, I suppose I would come more from the position of saying if you look at a range of international research, it would suggest that an education system that is divided in different ways has a much greater potential of leading into different types of narrow perceptions of the other. And I think that that's quite well established within research. And from my perspective, I think the point was raised, were we presenting a hostility about shared education or genuine concern? For me, it would be a genuine concern that we need to outline the roadmap. And as somebody sitting back reading the documents, when I look at these documents, I have no sense of what this looks like in 25 years. To me, it seems like a series of initiatives that are now being outlined. And so when I say a long-term vision, I'm thinking that's where you, as politicians, have to provide a direction. And yes, that might bump up against choice at different moments in time, but that's what leadership is, would be my perception.
And whilst you may not agree with all the terms, I mean, I think the common feature in many of these situations, whether you call it separate schooling, whether you call it a segregated system, what they have in common is that the state is systematically funding separation of our children based on identity factors. The system is being funded systematically by the state. And the missing piece in our situation is a choice, if you like, which has been able to secure the confidence of sufficient parents from across the whole of the community that is also seen as a legitimate choice. So if you actually look at societies that have made this transformation or change from highly sectorised education systems, they have not done it through voluntary integration. Desegregation in the United States would not have happened if it had been left to parents to voluntarily integrate. The ANC took a decision not to continue with separate schooling in South Africa. It had to have an element of leadership and legislative leadership as well by the state, by the governance of the state, in order to provide an option that parents would have confidence in across the many different identity groups within the society. So, there's a missing piece in our jigsaw, so there's a missing choice, and it's a choice that the state hasn't yet provided. There was an aspiration, we know, in the foundation, and there's a history.
But even, I suppose, to go back on the issues, South Africa and America, of course, we were talking about race relations. Here, a lot of the fears, of course, is more national identities and contest over even constitutional issues that perhaps didn't exist in them. And even with America, and we see, and this is another issue, is that the Coleman report identified educational outcomes stayed exactly the same when desegregation happened. So, do we need to look at
except in areas where there was socio-economic mixing,
and that's where and
this is where there's confusion in the. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, but it's, that's another part of it, and I think it's very important. But to me, and just finally, Chair, that there's some confusion even on my own behalf. Is it a case where we want to get to a point where there is entire equality of choice, that every single parent has the choice of an integrated solution or not? And if that is the case, well then of course you're going to have to publicly fund differently. Or is it a case that we want a single system because anything else simply won't do? Because that's where some of the criticism of shared, I don't understand. Or if we say, we want equality of choice across the board, well then shared is bringing them different sectors together in different ways, and that surely can only be a good thing. So in myself there's still that confusion,
That would be fine if that was not taking an option. The political leadership, if you like, are sort of challenged to say which direction are we going in this society. But it's not, there isn't an open checkbook. We've got to be realistic, and we've got to, make that choice. All these diverse groups to have their own schools and their own options, it's the most expensive option.
Thank you. Mr. Craig?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've listened with interest to what you're saying, and In some respects, I have no argument with what you're saying about schools being segregated, because if you have a faith-based education system of any description, there has to be a level of segregation there. Parents have chosen that option. Are you saying to me that under no circumstances should government fund faith-based education?
You're asking this of me, right?
Yes.
There's a difference between faith-based education and faith-based schooling. And in most societies that have resolved this issue, there's been an ability to provide faith-based education in the context of more plural schools and learning environments. And I think that's the resolution of it. It's quite similar to the question about religious education. Of course, that can be provided within the context. And it happens in many schools, and it happens in faith-based schools.
I'm listening carefully to what you're saying, because I get the idea that you're saying there should be no Catholic maintained sector in Northern Ireland, because I can't take anything else out of what you're saying there. Is that impression right or wrong?
No, I'm not saying there shouldn't be a Catholic. I'm saying part of the dilemma we have found ourselves in is that we have a highly sectorised and therefore politicised education system in terms of its governance, in terms of those employed within it, and in terms of the enrolment of children in those separate schools. And what shared education, presumably, that you support is trying to do is find a way out of that. I am raising critical questions about whether that is going to be the way that we will find out of that. There will need to be some kind of more structural, systematic change, which may not necessarily mean that people who want faith-based schooling as well as faith-based education, there may be a place for it in that. But I think you need to distinguish you need to distinguish between faith-based schooling and faith-based education. And it's possible to provide faith-based education within a plural school system.
Yeah. I think we can play about with words all we want. We all know what we're hinting at here.
Sorry, I'm not clear what being hinted at.
Faith-based education and faith-based teaching seem to go together in the Catholic maintained sector, so it's either right or it's wrong. I don't know. I don't send my child to a Catholic maintained school, therefore I have no idea. But it is a choice that thousands of parents across Northern Ireland make every single year, and I'm not going to sit here and question that choice that they make. I think they have every right to make it.
Of course, if they want a faith-based education for their children, they have every right to have it. I'm saying within the structural arrangements we have at the minute, that doesn't necessitate governance, employment, enrolment also being determined by faith within our education institutions.
The other thing which has always puzzled me about the integrated sector is these high-level indicators that tell us that everybody's on for the integrated sector. I'll tell you what puzzles me. After 30-odd years, you have 7% of the children being educated in the integrated sector. The other thing that absolutely baffles me around this, I watched with interest one of our own local primary schools transform into the integrated sector. Now, it was heavily pushed by the senior management in the school, but it was a process which literally took 10 years. There was several parental meetings around it, and several times the parents rejected that option. And on the last occasion, it was only passed by 3 votes at a parents' meeting. Now, that doesn't tell me that there's a huge sway of people out there really interested in integrated education. Does that not indicate that some of these high-level indicators you're talking about just can't be right?
I think that's a question for the representatives of the integrated education.
The attitudinal polls that reflect the community's aspiration that their children are taught side by side can't be ignored. The fact that...
But are they right?
Are they ready?
Are they correct?
Well, they're scientifically conducted polls which are approved by the British Polling Council. The methodology of them, I think, can't be questioned. The actual results are pretty consistent with successive polls over the last 20 years. I think the challenge that you put down, that 79% would support their school transforming the integrated status, whilst only 7% actually send their children to schools, I think was dealt with when Professor Brandon Hamber suggested that there's a whole host of reasons for that. The geographical locations of integrated schools. There are many parents that just can't access an integrated school. Integrated schools aren't planned by the government or the department. They are set up by parents. There is no other school sector or education sector that has those challenges or barriers put in front of it. So that is one of the reasons why we have only 7% of children going to integrated schools. I think it was referred to as well by Trevor in a previous with the previous CRC and the Equality Commission, that if the same incentives were put in front for integrated education as has been put in front of shared education, then perhaps we would have much more of a more children going to integrated schools.
Can I also add as well, as one of the recent things that has helped unblock the growth of integrated education has been the Jumra judicial review. I mean, since then there's been about 10 development proposals that have gone through for integrated schools to increase, and the majority of those, I think 7 or 8 of them, have actually gone through, and they're all for increased numbers. The majority of them are for primary schools to go for double enrolment, for post-primary schools to increase numbers as well. So that has opened the door where the department now recognises it has that duty, and those proposals have gone through. So there has been, like I say, 7 or 8 of those have gone through, and there is more in the system. So you'll see more of these coming through. So there will be an increased number of integrated places available through that. But that is actually mainly through the existing schools growing.
If I can maybe just add to that, I mean, I think to look at the growth of integrated education outside of the context of an extreme political conflict wouldn't do justice to its development. To expect that people would have been able to come together, create all these integrated spaces in the midst of a conflict over the last 30 years, when the conflict itself was driving those things apart, you could actually turn it around and say 7% is quite a remarkable figure in that type of a context. So I think to just assume that it could grow at the same rate, notwithstanding also the information from my colleagues here, I think just it doesn't take into account the context that was actually developed in. You know, I think in relation to your other comments, I mean, I don't envy the challenge that you have to deal with in relation to this. All I can do from my perspective is read the information, integrate it, have a look at it, and feed some of that back. And in that context, it is very hard to see how maintaining a multiple form of choices over a long period of time is a financially sustainable way of actually going ahead with the education system. So I would think the type of comments that have been made by IEF here, that one needs a much more detailed sense of analysis, a cost-benefit analysis over a long-term period with some sort of a vision, is a much safer way to go than to simply say, well, yeah, we understand the context, we understand why there are all these multiple choices, everyone has that option and we're just going to stick with that. I can't see when you analyse the documents that is a sustainable form of a future. And then to add shared education on top of that, as much as I'm in favour of shared education, you might just be investing in another ongoing, very expensive community relations project, when actually there might be another way of restructuring it. Notwithstanding, you're absolutely right, it'll take 10, 20, 30 years, of course it will, you know, but that's the challenge that I think we're facing.
Given it's my last question, Chair. Given what you're saying about it, basically you're saying there should be some sort of forced movement almost towards this. That's what I'm getting. Some legislative rationale behind forcing people down this route. You've quoted two big examples. You've quoted South Africa, and you've also quoted the United States. Now, I have researched both of those with some interest because I had a family in both. What I found fascinating when I looked at it all was when you go down this route of forced integration, it seems to, now it looks from the figures I have saw, it looks as if you may well force the integration from a racialist point of view, if you know what I mean. You mix the races, but ironically, from a social point of view, you seem to separate the haves from the have-nots, and that the haves choose to send their children to private education, elitist education almost, out of the government system altogether. Would that not be the inevitable consequences of doing the same here?
Well, that question was asked actually in the context as well of the inquiry over selection. And the conclusions from that was we don't have an economy that could sustain a private schooling system here. We're a very small system. We have 1,000 schools or something like that, and parents who wish private education are very well served by grammar schools in this system. So there's no real incentive for them to, send children to private schools. So I don't think that would be dynamic.
Can I just make a response to that? I mean, I didn't use the word forced, but what I would say is your first step is what is your vision? And when you read the policy documents, the vision is quite confusing. And I quoted a number of them, because in a number of them it says the lack of integration in schools is a problem. We need to fix it. And there are numerous documents coming out of government in different places making that sort of a statement. And then there isn't really a policy that matches a way of trying to answer that question. So before we say we're going down the route of forcing people into a certain direction, I would say, what is the vision around this committee of what sort of education system it would look like to see? And that might be, as you did in the TBUC strategy, 2025 we want peace walls down. It might be by 2040, it might be by 2050. How are we going to get there? And how are we going to get there that we don't repeat the mistakes that other people have made, that we take that information and we say, let's do that better? And that is more of a legacy linked to the hard work that people have done on this peace process than not posing that vision. So for me, I would say the vision and what you want to get to is step one. Now, of course, there might be cajoling, forcing, different types of incentives in that process, but that's going to be a long-term and complicated process. You can't just say tomorrow we're forcing something down X, Y, and Z.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lunn.
Thanks, Chair. Normally just say thank you for your presentation, but that really doesn't do justice today, because that's the biggest dose of realism and common sense that I've listened to in 7 years of sitting here. You've laid bare, Professor Smith, can I start with you, the deficiencies and the contradictions in the government proposal, and so have you, Brandon. And the work of the IEF I don't need to comment on, because I support it absolutely. But so I've only got one question, Chair, really. It's pretty simple. I'll address it to yourself, Brandon. You've talked about the international context and the international perplexity, perhaps, at the way that we have continued to do things here. What would the international view be of something like the Moy solution? Are you familiar with it?
I mean, broadly, I can't say intimately.
No.
Look, I can't speak for the entire international community, but broadly speaking, people would think the idea of trying to move schools under the same type of a roof and trying to build a system around that type of a structure you know, it seems quite antithetical to a lot of what would be said in the international literature, certainly. Which is not to say that there wouldn't be support for areas of integration, transformation, connection. I don't think anyone's naive to say that one shouldn't have some of that as well. But I think people would be quite perplexed. I mean, the most well-known case is Alan can speak about that, is the Bosnian case, which attached a lot of international attention.
Well, I'm not too sure about learning from Bosnia, but Alan, have you any thoughts about this? Or?
Well, I mean, I think the figures you quoted in terms of the parental views from the Moy tell the story.
Yeah, but
there's a fairly equal group of parents who would prefer to see one school. And there's another group and I've had people of both those groups have contacted me since that Spotlight programme. So there's already different opinions within within the parents there. It will be an expensive experiment, and we will see how it unfolds. And I would hope that it would, be a positive experience.
I would sincerely hope that it's a one-off. I mean, it is one of the government's so far 3 selected programmes. It's going to get support. It just seems unreal to me that they could come up with a solution like that and not go the whole hog through a wee bit of cajoling or encouragement or incentives to do the obvious thing, which they will probably come to in 10 or 20 years anyway.
Well, I think it avoids, those solutions do tend to avoid the 2 other big structural issues which I referred to in my opening remarks, which is institutional change. What are the arrangements for shared governance of those schools, or on the OMA side? What are the arrangements for shared staffing and the employment of teachers, so that all the pupils in all of those schools on the same site or under the same roof or whatever have their learning opportunities enriched by being taught by educators from different backgrounds. Those are if we keep focusing on children and changing their attitudes, their perceived intolerance or whatever, we're just avoiding those other key issues, I think.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. McCausland.
Just 2 quick points there. Alan, you referred there to, at one point, the issue of areas of particular disadvantage where there were maybe not the same extent, there was not the same extent of sharing in some of those areas of social disadvantage. I wasn't clear on that, because I can think in North Belfast where you have very high levels of disadvantage and more interfaces and violent interfaces and troubled interfaces than anywhere else in Northern Ireland. There are schools there that are, I'm not going to name them, but I'm thinking of 2 that are a couple of 100 yards apart on either side of a very difficult peace line, and they're involved in a number of programmes. So high level of disadvantage, high level of division, and yet they're doing it. Is there some documentary evidence for the point that you were making?
What I was doing was drawing on the statements in the department's business plan, which made the statement that only 65% of schools, 700 and I'm not sure the exact number, 762 or something, would access this funding because the others are too culturally isolated. Now, within that culturally isolated group, it would be interesting for the department to tell us, how does that map onto social deprivation?
Is that not more to do with rural areas where you've got huge swathes of the country will be overwhelmingly Catholic or overwhelmingly?
Well, we don't know. We don't know. The department haven't clarified it. But what I'm saying is the possible consequence is if there's a mapping of social disadvantage on the cultural isolation, then you are only funding those who are not culturally isolated. So you are therefore widening the inequalities gap between.
There's a need for a bit of clarity around where indeed the lack of sharing at the moment occurs, and how that correlates with economic advantage. It
would have been good to think of that in advance,
for the
creating the business plan.
But pass that on to the department. And just the other quick point was, there are 2 sectors that have a different position insofar as integrated and Irish medium. you talked about Catholic schools and or schooling and Catholic education. Presumably the same thing could apply there, Irish medium schooling and Irish medium education. I'm not sure. How would you see in shared situation Irish medium fitting in?
In a sense, I can't speak for the Irish medium, but I can only give an opinion and an interpretation on it. But in a sense, I see Irish medium education kind of caught in the same dilemma as integrated education, in that its intention was not to be a sector. The intention of the early integrated schools was to demonstrate this is a viable option, but that it's another way that the system could be organised, but with more inclusive schools. Equally, my impression, the contact I had in the 80s with those who were advocating for Irish medium education, was not to become a sector. It was to have that entitlement to Irish language education available throughout our system. So in a sense, integrated education and Irish language or Irish medium education, in a sense, are collateral damage of our sectorised education, our highly sectorised system.
Looking into the future,
yeah,
how would it fit in?
Irish medium. Well, I think there should be an entitlement for all pupils in Northern Ireland to have access to mother tongue language instruction. That presents a huge challenge, but whether that was a state school or whether that's a Catholic maintained school or whatever, there should be that opportunity for mother tongue language of instruction. I mean, that's a kind of universal right. Now, the implementation of it's very difficult, and it would be the same situation for Ulster Scots, I would assume.
There's no desire there for schools, I can assure you.
There's no desire there for schools, even though it would technically be an entitlement, but there's no desire for it. I think their cultural rights can be met within the controlled sector or whatever sector. Yeah, okay, that's fine.
So I'm basically saying that's what my position would be on this. An entitlement.
Mr. Hazard.
Thanks. And just to come in at the end, really, I'd be interested, really, just a couple of quick points to finish, perhaps. What do you think the department should do straight away? What is the most important thing we could get on with to fulfil, the ambitions we've talked about? Equally, this committee inquiry, what's the most important thing we need to be addressing or saying in this inquiry, again, in your opinion? And just lastly, do you feel there's a duty upon the department to provide secular education to those that want it? Often I feel it's a white elephant in this whole debate, and that, to me, integrated is still an ecumenical, still faith-based to a certain extent. We're still talking about religion. We're not actually talking about secular separation of church and state entirely. Do you feel that there's an onus on the department to provide that?
Okay, maybe if I just start off, I would say what the integrated movement would like to see is that certainly an analysis of the benefits and costs of shared and integrated education going forward. I would also like to see the vision, which is missing, that Brampton's talking about, and as well, one of the key things would be very much important for us is to actually have community engagement and really find out what communities want, and not to assume what's there is what they want. Do you want to add anything to that, Sam?
No, just to reiterate the need for community engagement and community audits. And I suppose I would like to see some accessible evidence base that would help policymakers in their decision making around strategy and in particular sort of the fiscal element, which I suppose the independent review of shared and integrated education and the impact that it would have would feed into that.
Do you want to say? Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say, in terms of secular education, the integrative movement have always struggled with this scenario. The aim was to have a multiple faiths in school, in one school, and there is the option for parents to opt out within that as well. But we always thought it was easier to put everything in and then later on let parents decide if they want to withdraw their child from the religious education. There's always been a case, put everything in and get everybody to agree that, and then people want to withdraw. That's it.
Yeah, so it's a difficult question. I mean, I think from my side, I'd probably say some of the things which IEF have just outlined in terms of the cost-benefit type of analysis. I think I would like to see us moving away from trying to assess what strategies are being proposed in quite a narrow way. So saying, you know, if we start getting greater sharing, this might improve relationships, and to maybe step back from that and say, we're trying to improve relationships in what type of a context, and how is what we're doing impacting on this wider context. And to put that very much, and I alluded to it a little bit in the beginning of my submission, in the international context, where others around the world are focusing very much on trying to educate their children with as much diversity and cross-cultural input as possible, to make them as competitive in the world as possible. And here there seems to be, every time we raise issues like integration and other sorts of things, a rolling back from that. And I actually think there's a massive opportunity right now. There's a massive opportunity to do this differently. And I would like to see some vision in people grasping that and taking it forward. So the simple thing would be, if there's one thing, I know it's almost impossible, but if there was some way of getting around the table and saying, this is where we want the system to be, and how do we get there? And that might have multiple avenues to get there. It's going to be complicated, but that for me would be the single thing. In terms of your secular question, I'm an educator. I work at a university, and I would say that for me the primary role of education is to teach people to think critically. And what I would like to see, and I think some integrated schools do achieve this, maybe not all of them, and obviously some other schools achieve this as well, but an environment in which people can learn about whatever religion they want, they can express whatever sense of secularism they want, they can express their atheism in whatever way they want, and we teach young people to have a critical engagement with that. And we move away from this idea that this is embedded within this type of sectoral learning. And granted, I accept the comments about, does this mean the end of a Catholic education-based system? I don't know what that looks like down the long term. My advice, simply from looking at international lessons, would be, if we can bring that all into one place, let people engage with their religions in different ways and secularism in different ways, we've got a much better hope for the future.
I think on the secular provision, I mean, my feeling is, certainly personally, I would encourage my children, I would, engage with them about whether they wanted to participate in religious education or indeed religious instruction in some of our schools. But my position would be on it that any school that is in receipt of state funding from the taxpayer should have a responsibility to provide education for all faiths and none. And so I don't think the opt-out is sufficient. If my child was opted out of any faith provision, I would expect his or her time to be used constructively, and not just simply left to twiddle their thumbs or to be supervised in some room. There's quite a lot of research has been done in the Republic of Ireland, actually, on that, where many parents who didn't want their children to be involved in religious education provision were complaining that then their children were being neglected and not adequately educated, provided with educational alternatives. So I think the responsibility should be on all schools. In terms of what the department should do, well, it seems the way the legislation is stacking up, that this power to facilitate, encourage and promote will be devolved through the Education Authority. Sounds like however it ends up being defined. Sure, it might be defined as Irish medium education. I'm sure that would doing this retrospective sort of definitions. So in a sense, I think that's a role for the Education Authority with statutory authority. What I would do is say to the department, okay, after 25 years, maybe it's time that the statutory responsibility on the department to encourage and facilitate integrated education. I'm not talking about simply a sector. Integrated education, finding out how our system, promoting how our system could be more integrated, that they should also have a statutory responsibility to promote it. The state should start to take responsibility for this, rather than for 25 years discharging the responsibility by giving about £500,000 a year to a voluntary, semi-governmental body to try and change a whole system. It's not good enough. We should have the sort of governance now that can take on these challenges and give leadership on them. So give the department a statutory responsibility, extend it to promote as well as encourage and facilitate.
Just only a one-line comment, Chair, that the Assembly actually voted in favour of doing exactly that about 3 years ago now, but the department didn't take a blind bit of notice. Private member's motion happened to be mine.
Okay, Mrs. Overend.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for your presentation. I just really wanted to pick up, you know, it can't all be done at once, and I think you recognise that. But going forward from where we are now, would you suggest that there be more integration at, do we start at post-primary level or do we start at primary level? You know, saying we can't do it all at once, where do you think that it would be more beneficial to begin?
Do you answer that?
I think wherever the parental demand is, it's not forcing integrated education, is where there is parental demand. I'm going to say a majority of the integrated primary schools have all put in proposals to increase their numbers because there is the demand there. So, and that will then feed into the post-primary. As you're maybe not aware as well, a lot of the post-primary schools are this year will be submitting development proposals to increase their numbers as well. So there is going to be a lot more development proposals coming through, but it's where the parental demand already exists. I would say as well, Sam had alluded earlier on to the fact that it is not the Department of Education who plan for integrated education. It's actually expected to be for a new integrated school. It's actually parents who are expected to do it. So that's a massive task on parents to ask them to plan for a new integrated school. So what I would say is that the department, along with the Education Authority, should actually take this responsibility on and actually plan. Look to see in an area where there is potential changes. Look to see what parents want. Ask parents what they want. And if it is integrated education, then to provide an integrated school.
Just on the asking parents issue, you've mentioned that previously, and sometimes you find that when surveys are done, you know, parents are in favour of integrated education, but yet when it comes to actually choosing it, they're not choosing it. How do you think that finding out about that parental choice can be done more effectively? Well,
so far what we've been involved in is a lot of polling and asking an independent polling company to do the polling, but it has to be more than polling. It has to be community engagement. You need to go into the area, get the right stakeholders, ask them, find out who the right stakeholders are, bring them together, let them be aware of the different types of system, what will happen, the changes, where the local schools are, where the surplus places are, what's the vision for the area, and then to have focus groups with these. This would take a period of time. It's not something that quick polling that would be the end of it. It can take 2 to 3 months at the end, having all this information, and then feed it back to the parents, and then there's going to be a final poll or ballot at the end to see what parents actually want. There hasn't been anything like this. I am not aware, except the deliberative poll that you have mentioned in the Omagh area. There hasn't been anything. It's been just one-off polls, so this hasn't been done before. And the department have mentioned what they're looking for is an independent mechanism. So it's to help the department find that independent mechanism and to do this in areas.
I think from a research perspective, we have the quantitative data, 20 years of surveys, and we have the quantitative stuff. I think we need the qualitative data. You know, what do people really think? Going out, asking them a much more, you know, detailed at the community level type of engagement to really understand, do people know what the choices are? How are they making those sorts of choices? And I think what we might find is quite interesting compared to what we actually think in terms of how people go about making that decision.
A quick practical response from me. Where to start? Well, it's in the plan for the department already. Appoint 20 people who will go out and be the development workers to try and work with people on the ground, find out what is the appetite for integration, how would that integration take place. These are investments that are now going into our education system that have never been invested in facilitating people, exploration of people's appetite for integration. So I think there are 15 development officers, £36,000 a year. Do the same, promote integrated education the same. Spirit of equality.
Can I thank you all for your submissions and for taking the time to come to committee today. Apologies again for the delay, but I do appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Members, we have
Chair, sorry, the committee then wants to write to the department just regarding the Delivering Social Change signature project and whether there is facility within that to support voluntary collaborations. And also, the members also want to write to the Equality Commission. They'd indicated that they were about to produce some research on educational inequalities.
Okay, thank you. I'm just mindful that we probably will be thrown out of this room in the next couple of minutes. So just refer you to correspondence at pages 175 to 298 with 9 items. Are members content that we note, or do you have any particular issue in any of those pieces? Okay, thank you very much. Moving then to draft forward work programme. The draft is at page 301 to 304. Just to remind you again that we have our area planning event this evening in the Long Gallery, commencing from 6, probably commencing around 6:30, but guests will be arriving around 6. Appreciate a good turnout of members. There is a pack which is tabled, so you can take that away and have a look at that in advance so that you have done adequate preparation for the event. If members are content then to endorse the forward work programme, I don't have any changes. Okay. Members have any other business?
There was mention there in the Integrated Education, Integrated Education Fund presentation on page 1 about Catholic children get sacramental preparation at P3, 4 and 7. Protestant children can avail of the Delving Deeper programme. Is it possible just to get some information about that? Yeah. And secondly, I hear people talking about this spotlight programme at Drumrah or about whatever. About the Moy, sorry. Is it possible, is that still available on iPlayer or something? No, I didn't see it at the time. It may be.
Perhaps we'll ask the clerk.
That term will not be the term. Hopefully, it's not that's used in answer. But could somebody get me a wee DVD?
We'll ask the clerk to speak to the BBC.
Speak nicely to BBC. Yes.
Okay. Although, mind you, Chair of the Culture, Arts and Leisure Committee, you'd think we'd have very good contacts within the BBC, but certainly the previous chair had.
Used up all my favours already.
Okay, the date and time of the next meeting is in this room. We are not going to Lurgan and to Sierra School, unfortunately, due to the possibility of welfare reform moving into the next day. So we are here at 10 o'clock next Wednesday. And don't forget about this evening.
Name and shame the culprits now. Come on.
Apologies, I can't be there. I'll fight for a Westminster seat.
What's the point of fighting for a seat when you don't take it?
Yeah, it was coming.